The Wind Waker marked the end of an era for the Legend of Zelda series. It abandoned the many long-established design philosophies of its predecessors while instead seeking to attract a completely new audience of younger players, even ending the game in both the literal and metaphorical destruction of the world of Hyrule. To say that the Zelda series was forever changed after this game's release would be an understatement. That's why it took me 5.5 hours to fully explore that topic in my last review. But the exact impact of this decision and where the series would go from here is actually a topic we won't be exploring in this video. Because before the financial and fan reactions to The Wind Waker could be fully analyzed and appreciated by Nintendo, another Zelda game had already been in the works for quite some time. A side project, developed by a completely separate but familiar team. Flagship, a subsidiary of Capcom who had previously developed the Oracle duology, a pair of side games made for the Legend of Zelda series. In many ways, this new Zelda game was completely unaffected by the release of The Wind Waker, except in only the most surface level of ways. The art style took some inspiration from The Wind Waker, but really only in the design for its main characters, like Link, Zelda, and the King of Hyrule. Otherwise, this game was meant to be its own unique Zelda experience, developed by a team completely divorced from the mistakes of the previous major entry in this series. As such, its design is much more akin to that of older Zelda titles, while still retaining many of the quirks that a Capcom-developed Zelda game is bound to have. Truthfully, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap is kind of a mishmash of previous games' design philosophies, art styles, and even music composition, with elements from Majora's Mask, the Oracle duology, and The Wind Waker all mixing harmoniously into its crowded little setting. Ultimately, I believe the end result is a bit of a mixed bag, as you'll no doubt come to see over the course of this review. But if there's any one thing I could say in the Minish Cap's defense, it would be that, unlike in the case of its Oracle cousins, it is a uniquely one-of-a-kind experience, with its own completely original design philosophy and game structure that you won't find in any other Zelda title before or since. This was Hidemaru Fujibayashi's vision. His first, and as we now know in retrospect, far from his last attempt at making a Zelda game that was truly his own. Did he succeed? Is this game any good? Is it not a complete shit show the way the last game in this series was? These are the key questions I seek to answer in this review, and in order to do that, we'll be going through this game's level design, gameplay, story, music, and all its other little intricacies in excruciating detail. So with all that being said, let's finally get into discussing the third and final game in the Capcom trilogy of Zelda titles, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap. Minish Cap begins, like many other Zelda games, with an opening text crawl, detailing the beginning of an ancient legend. Long ago, darkness ruled the land as monsters ravaged the people of Hyrule, until one day, a hero of man was bestowed a holy sword by the Bokori, a race of tiny elves the size of a thumb, who had descended from the sky to assist humanity in their time of need. With courage and wisdom, as well as the power bestowed upon him by the Bokori, the hero of man drove out the monsters and sealed their darkness away for good. The people, in reverence of their saviors, then enshrined the sacred blade and kept it safe for generations to come. After the text crawl, the game opens with a cutscene showing Princess Zelda approaching a lone house out in Hyrule Field. She asks its owner, a blacksmith named Smith, very original I know, where his grandson Link is, and the man shouts upstairs to wake the boy up. The scene then shifts to Link's perspective, and the game finally begins. Kind of. We're not actually free to explore the world quite yet. See, Link is tasked with sort of a milk run at the beginning of this game. The Minister of Hyrule needs a sword delivered, and Zelda wants to borrow Link for the day to attend the Bokori Festival together. So our first task is actually quite mundane in nature. For you see, Hyrule isn't actually overrun with monsters, demons, or devils of any kind just yet. Instead, a completely peaceful Hyrule town awaits us, hosting a beautiful centennial festival for us to participate in. This section's fully playable, and in many ways actually reminds me quite a lot of the opening to Chrono Trigger. In fact, I'm actually quite convinced that Fujibayashi takes a lot of inspiration from Final Fantasy and Sakaguchi in general, but that's a topic we'll get into a bit later in the video. The town is full of little stalls with merchants and games, and NPCs who will convey background lore regarding the Bokori and the meaning of the festival in general. But unlike with Chrono Trigger, the things we can actually do and the choices we can make here are, well, entirely non-existent. You just follow Zelda around as she interacts with each and every aspect aspect of the festival, until she plays a minigame off-screen and wins a shield that she gives to Link. It's far from a great opening because there's really nothing going on here in terms of actual gameplay, but if there is one compliment I can extend here, I do think that it succeeds in characterizing Princess Zelda in this game. She's boisterous, energetic, almost manic in her interests and attention span, and generous too, given the gift she carefully picks out for Link. It isn't exactly Casablanca or anything, but hey, actual character writing is more than what we got from Fujibayashi in his first attempt at a Zelda game, so I suppose I'm just pleasantly surprised more than anything else. Unfortunately, the moment doesn't last. The festival ends as soon as it begins, and the player now has to head north in order to drop Smith's sword off at the castle. The minister graciously accepts our weapon, Zelda peels off, and a ceremony celebrating the winner of the local sword fighting competition begins. But disaster soon strikes. The winner, a sorcerer named Vaati, only sought to use the ceremony to get close to the sacred Picori blade, and shatters it with a blast of magic, releasing the evil contents of the box it previously sealed. Vaati then turns Princess Zelda to stone, vows to search for a sacred power called the Light Force, and knocks Link unconscious. When the boy comes to, the King of Hyrule explains to him that the magic Vaati released has caused monsters to pop up throughout Hyrule, and that the only way to make everything right again is by reforging the Picori blade and breaking the curse put on Princess Zelda. So what does he need Link for? Well, turns out adults can't see the Picori, only a child with a pure heart can. And Link is, well, closer to being a child than the castle soldiers are, I guess, so he'll probably do. And so we're tasked with heading southeast to the Minish Woods, where the Picori are said to dwell even to this day. We're given a sword, we exit the castle, and the game finally, truly begins. The opening of the Minish Cap is less than graceful in its execution. The main problem I have here is that it front-loads the vast majority of its storytelling all in this little opening just to sorta get it out of the way. Princess Zelda is your childhood friend, Vaati is the villain, there are tiny invisible creatures called Picori who assist humanity, they'll help repair the ancient blade, Princess Zelda is now turned to stone, save her. It's a lot of information all being conveyed within a section of gameplay that'll only last 15 minutes at most, maybe 5 if you don't actually read the dialogue and just spam through it. I'm a bit mixed on this approach. On the one hand, I think it's nice that Princess Zelda in this game has a personal connection to Link and actually has a personality, which is more than I can say for certain other iterations of this character. The way she manically runs between each stall, completely switches her focus depending on whatever it is she immediately sets her eyes upon, and the fact that her gift to Link is something to protect her with actually says a lot about their relationship. There's this little text blurb you can check out near the end of the game that conveys that Zelda actually likes Link a lot, but wishes that he was more manly, which explains why she chose to give him the shield. She wants her childhood friend to become her knight in shining armor, which, fittingly enough, is what he turns into over the course of this game's events. It's some cute characterization, and actually gives the player some motivation to save her. Is what I would like to say, but frankly, 5 minutes of dialogue isn't enough to endear a player to any character in a video game, no matter how well written they might be. Because the fact of the matter is, we never so much as hear Zelda speak again until the very end of the game, like literally in the last 5 minutes. That's the only other time she ever talks over the course of this story. It's easy to forget that she's even the driving force of the plot in the first place. Honestly, stopping Vaati from acquiring the Light Force becomes far more important to all the characters in this game pretty much from the second dungeon onwards. Zelda won't so much as be mentioned again until right before entering the final dungeon, so I have to ask, what do we actually gain from spending all this time characterizing Princess Zelda? If you want my honest opinion, I think that Fujibayashi was genuinely trying to go for the Chrono Trigger opening here. Meet a boisterous princess at a fair, take her on a pseudo date, witness her get into trouble, and set out on a quest to save her. I'm sure that seemed like a brilliant idea at the time. Chrono Trigger is a brilliant game with a great opening, but the key difference is, Chrono Trigger has you successfully save Marle within the first 2 hours of the game, then spend the entire rest of your journey with her as a companion character, hearing dialogue, witnessing character interactions, and seeing her grow into an effective fighter. And then, at the beginning of the third act, she takes over Chrono's protagonist role as she, in turn, seeks to save him when he's in trouble. It's an effective bit of storytelling, and one of my favorite love stories in all of gaming history. Seriously, go watch my review on that game if you haven't already. I love that RPG to death. Meanwhile, the Minish Cap doesn't do any of this. It copies the same beginning, albeit with none of the freedom of choice you get in Chrono Trigger, but doesn't have the same goal in mind. Why spend time trying to endear us to a character we won't even hear speak again until the very final moments of the video game? If you think I'm being too harsh here, keep in mind, this is the entire ludo-narrative crux of the game we're being presented with here. And more importantly, Fujibayashi, this game's lead writer and director, would go on to repeat this exact same plot structure in a later major Zelda Zelda release. This plot point isn't small, it speaks to the fundamental weakness of the Minish Cap storytelling, and more broadly, to Fujibayashi's weaknesses as a writer, which will be a very important point to remember come future entries in this series of Zelda reviews. But okay, the writing isn't that important in a game like this, I suppose, because once the king gives us our sword and tells us to set off, the world of Hyrule will finally open up for the player to explore. Kind of. Not really. See, there's a whole overworld map in this game, just like in all past Zelda titles, but you can't actually explore any of it at the given moment. Instead, both old-school progression gates, like bombable rocks and other such obstacles, as well as more arbitrary ones, like the sudden appearance of some construction workers, will block off most routes that you'll be able to take in this overworld. Thus, the player will be railroaded into heading toward the southeast corner of the map, and therefore to the Minish Woods. Conveniently, the very location the king just told us to explore. Unlike with the storytelling, I am much less conflicted about my conclusions regarding this particular design choice. It's garbage. Not that railroading the progression in a Zelda game is unheard of. In many ways, most other Zelda titles also seek to gate off parts of their overworlds until the appropriate time comes. And that's fine. My problem is that everything in the Minish Cap, from the collectibles to the exploration to even the goddamn main story itself, is gated off behind completely arbitrary progression gates. It's a problem that kind of defines the Minish Cap as a whole, and we see this pretty much immediately within the woods themselves. The player will enter the forest and make his way deep into its heart, finding at the center an old shrine where the Picori once lived. But the player can't actually do anything once he gets here, so what are we to do here? Well, in a normal Zelda game, this is where we would have to backtrack, explore the environment, and find some sort of tool or puzzle to solve in order to open the way forward. That's honestly kind of the whole appeal of these games, isn't it? To explore the game world and investigate it for yourself, no? Well, Minish Cap doesn't seem to think so. Instead, the moment the player arrives at the shrine, the game will suddenly show a cutscene of a lone talking Cap being harassed by Octoroks at an earlier point in the woods. Why we couldn't have just run into this guy on our way towards the shrine, since we had to have passed through this exact spot in order to get here, or why the game couldn't have found a more creative way to present this information to the player is beyond me. Either way, this is the game's messy way of introducing the player to two key mechanics. The first being Eslo, our guide character. He's fine for the most part. There will be a couple times in this game where he talks way too much and gets pretty annoying, mostly in some of the later dungeons, but otherwise he's a mostly inoffensive way for the developers to communicate tutorial information or dialogue between third-party characters and someone who represents Link, since he isn't allowed to speak for himself in these games. The second key mechanic, however, is a lot more game-changing, for you see, Eslo just so happens to be quite knowledgeable of the Picori and their ways, and teaches us how to use portals out in the overworld with which we can enter their world. One such portal lies, conveniently, just south of where we ran into him, an old tree stump, which, by climbing on top of, Link can use to shrink down to the size of a thumb and explore the overworld from a brand new perspective. This is the Minish Cap's main gimmick, the ability to switch between the normal-sized and now tiny versions of Link, and I would say that, for the most part, it's a pretty welcome addition to this game. It has its fair share of problems, don't get me wrong, but on the whole, I think it's an excellent idea executed with a fair amount of grace. The game immediately teaches its mechanics quite brilliantly too. The little tufts of grass we had no problem cutting down or walking over before turn into impassable forests for the Picori-sized version of Link, and small puddles, like the ones on the way towards the Deepwood shrine, become deadly bogs which Link will drown in. Thus, we will now be forced to look for an alternative route to the shrine, through a small hole leading into a bog with lily pads floating about, which the player can ride on top of in order to reach the Minish village. So already, we're taught the Picori form's limitations and utilities. Sure, you're slower and less able to move around broad swaths of the overworld in this form, but there are also secret little areas you can explore which are otherwise inaccessible to a person of Link's normal size, and you'll need to find a way to transform into a Picori and make your way to them if you want to progress through the game. It's a neat introduction to the mechanic, and the way the game ends up building on it throughout its runtime will be pretty great. The Minish village itself, meanwhile, doesn't have much of anything going on for it. There's a small quest here where you'll have to retrieve something called the Jabbernut to allow Link to learn the language of the Minish. This is a big nothing burger. You just talk to an NPC, visit a house, and bam, quest over. Don't know what the intent here was, it's kinda just random. Regardless, eating the nut allows us to speak to the Minish Elder, who explains that in order to repair the Picori blade, we'll need to collect the 4 essences of the elements and use them to power up the sword. Very generic, I know. And one of these essences just so happens to sit in the nearby temple, which we can only enter in our current Picori form. Thus can we finally enter this game's very first dungeon, Deepwood Shrine. Okay, so I know the review's been a bit critical up until this point, but for the Minish Cap fans in the audience, I would just like to say, you're in luck now. Because Deepwood Shrine is actually one of the best introductory dungeons from the entire Legend of Zelda series, and it's not even close. Seriously, this shit has no right being as good as it is, holy hell. The dungeon opens up by presenting 3 paths, 2 leading upstairs and another leading further into the first floor. But the stairways are currently blocked by some sticky webs, while the door leading north is gated off by a few statues. So, what gives? Well, while a veteran to the Zelda series might immediately know what to do here, this section isn't exactly made for veterans. Instead, the intention is to force newer players to experiment a bit, where they'll find that the webs are unbreakable, but the statues, by running up to them, can be pushed out of the way, thus opening a path forward while simultaneously teaching a valuable lesson. Objects in the environment can be pushed around and manipulated, potentially opening up new pathways to explore in the process. In the next room, we'll be introduced to our first dungeon enemies, the Slagula, who are essentially just squishies you can easily kill with a couple strikes from your sword. What's more notable about this room is the locked door waiting at the exit, with no way to get through, leaving the player with only one option. Search around the room for a way to open the path forward. And lo and behold, by pushing a couple pressure plates, we can light the torch sconces around the room and summon a chest, containing within it the small key needed to open the locked door. In the third room, a much different scene awaits us. A deep moat of water, which Link cannot swim across, will keep the player from reaching the door on the other side. So, what are we to do here? Well, it appears as though the beginning of a bridge sits at the mouth of the moat, with a lone lever waiting not too far from it. Eslo also hints that the player is able to pull on items as well as push them, and so the solution shouldn't be too difficult to figure out. Approach the lever, give it a pull, and watch as the bridge extends. But that only gets us halfway across the moat. The rest of the way will have to be traversed using this little mushroom, which the player can grab onto and pull just the way he did with the lever, and thus fling Link across the room and over the moat. So already, over the course of 3 simple, chronological puzzle rooms, the player has been immediately introduced to several of the foundational mechanics of Zelda dungeon design. Block pushing and pulling, locked doors and small keys, pressure plates, enemy encounters, and of course, platforming. More than just these simple mechanics though, the basics of Zelda dungeon design in general have been effectively conveyed to the player as well. Obstacles are bound to block your progress, which will require investigation and experimentation with the surrounding environment to overcome. Sometimes outside items can be used to open the way forward, like small keys and, later on, dungeon items, which will require exploration to find, leading to more puzzle solving, and oh look, there's the entire Zelda dungeon game loop conveyed in 3 simple rooms. It's the cleanest introduction to a Zelda game's level design that I have seen since, Ocarina of Time, but even compared to older games, it still matches up. It's always important for Zelda games to recreate the sort of fantastic, offhand tutorials we saw from the first title, because it's a perfect way of teaching new players the game's mechanics, while not completely boring the returning ones. And for that, I have to give this dungeon high praise. Even better though, the rest of the level, while also introducing further dungeon mechanics, still manages to craft an interesting level design all of its own. The moment we exit the tutorial rooms, the player will be presented with quite the wondrous sight indeed. A ginormous barrel, or really just a barrel as Eslo points out, since we're the ones who are small, and it's sitting right in the middle of the heart of the dungeon. The player can actually enter this barrel and exit from the other side, revealing that there are 5 pathways in total which branch out from this room, but for various reasons, most are completely inaccessible as of now. It is up to the player to investigate the room from here and discover a way forward. There are vines which seem to be holding the barrel in place, and some switches next to torch sconces like the ones we encountered earlier, and so it shouldn't be too hard to deduce the solution here. Activate the switches, burn away the vines, and re-enter the barrel to find that it can now be spun like a hamster wheel. This will allow the player to exit and enter from several new pathways, opening up more of the dungeon in the process. From here, 3 new paths present themselves, one leading to the basement at the bottom of the barrel, which is currently blocked off by a ginormous spider web, one leading to the east, which is currently blocked by a locked door, and another heading west. This particular branch of the dungeon presents several several past mechanics in a brand new light. The mushrooms make a return, but the player will now have to carefully pull back on them just enough to launch Link onto the opposite platform while not overshooting him too much. There's a pretty neat detail present in the environmental design which hints at this solution. Drag marks left on the stone floor indicate the perfect distance at which you should pull on the mushroom in order to launch Link to the other side. It's a great detail because it not only serves a gameplay purpose, but also flushes out the setting and makes the area look as though it saw many visitors in the ancient past, which, as the in-game lore details, is exactly the case. Switch puzzles, combined with block pushing, occupy the rooms going forward, ending in the acquisition of a small key. These are all decent enough challenges on their own, but they also serve to build on the mechanics we saw at the beginning of the dungeon. It's brilliant level design. Making our way back to the barrel room, the player can now head west and find another platforming section, followed by a small block pushing puzzle, and then a combat room full of bulldozers, little ladybug-like creatures who will charge erratically around the room. This fight ends with the acquisition of another small key, which the player can then use to head north and encounter the mini-boss, Matterpillar. This fight's pretty simple. You just need to avoid the Matterpillar as he weaves his way around the room, strike him in the head to stop him, and then hit him in the behind while you have the chance. But there's two curveballs that make things a little more difficult. First, the room is full of stone blocks that form small corridors, giving the player very little room to run around in. Second, the Matterpillar will enter a berserker-like state after recovering from the player's sword strikes, wherein he'll become entirely invulnerable and charge around the room at lightning speed. It's a pretty good boss fight, especially so for an introductory dungeon like this. After the fight, the player will receive his very first dungeon item, the Gust Jar. As the name implies, this is a magic jar which the player can use to suck up any material or shoot out a powerful gust of wind. The boss room teaches this immediately with the many webs lining the room. They resemble the very same obstacles we ran into at the very beginning of the dungeon, the ones we couldn't find a way to overcome. But now, by using our brand new tool, we find that the webs can easily be cleared by the suction power of the Gust Jar. No doubt, this should set alarm bells off in the player's head, as backtracking to earlier paths with webs in front of them will reveal that they can now be cleared by our new dungeon item. And the closest of these new pathways, and conveniently the one we're supposed to explore at this point, is the hole in the barrel from earlier that we couldn't yet explore, leading to the dungeon's basement floor. Here, we encounter one final utility of the Gust Jar. A large leaf serves as a raft, floating atop a river, which the player can get atop of and propel using wind from the Gust Jar. This mechanic is reminiscent to the way you could use the Korok leaf in The Wind Waker, but it's used to much greater effect here. You'll have to dodge flying bug enemies and avoid obstacles as you're sailing, and the boat moves much faster, so it's definitely an improvement on the mechanic for sure. This path leads to the acquisition of the boss key, and that's pretty much it for the dungeon. You just need to backtrack to the start and clear the webs to head up to the second floor, where the boss room lies. All in all, Deepwood Shrine is definitely one of the best first dungeons ever put in a Zelda game. It teaches basic dungeon mechanics, provides decent challenges, but most uniquely of all, it crafts a rich atmosphere unlike most other level designs in the entire Legend of Zelda series. This is a much larger point that applies to most of the dungeons in the Minish Cap and to the visuals more broadly, but to put it simply, holy hell, this dungeon's atmosphere is incredible. From the music, to the visuals, to the subtle environmental storytelling, Deepwood Shrine feels like a living, breathing temple, with a history that fits with its in-game lore. Hylia and Bikori both were said to have once met within this shrine, and while the abundance of cobwebs and dust blocking our path indicate that it has long since been abandoned, the permanent drag marks on the floor and the most well-preserved parts of the temple indicate a past presence. But so too does the barrel, a human-made item that was, perhaps, intentionally made part of the temple complex by the Bikori, whether as a gift or an adaptation to an unfortunate accident. There's a lot to speculate on here, and that's what I love so much about this dungeon. It conveys an abundance of mystique and wonder without ever uttering a word of dialogue to the player, and that's a feat that's so very rarely accomplished in Zelda dungeons, or even video games in general. The dungeon boss, meanwhile, caps off the level design quite well from a gameplay perspective. It is a green choo-choo, not even a special green choo-choo, just a normal one. But for the Bikori-sized Link, that's an enemy worthy of a boss fight. The choo-choo is invulnerable to normal sword strikes and will wander around the room looking to crush Link. The only way to make him vulnerable is by sucking up his gel with the Gust Jar, which will cause the creature to become top-heavy and fall to the ground, at which point, simple sword strikes to the face will damage him. This might seem like an exceedingly simple boss fight, but after he gets down the first time, the choo-choo will start to get far more aggressive, lunging at Link with a surprising amount of speed. Expert use of dodge rolling, a mechanic lifted straight from the 3D games, will be of great use here, but even an expert at the game will find these attacks difficult to dodge. It's a great fight all in all, and I love that it plays on Link's small size by having us fight a normal enemy in a completely new way. Like I said, Deepwood Shrine is a surprisingly rich and fleshed out level design, and definitely a huge step up from the kind of boring, wildly inconsistent designs we got from the Oracle games. Obviously, a singular good dungeon does not make a great game, and there's a lot more to go from here. But if Deepwood Shrine is anything to go by, then the team at Flagship have clearly upped their game since their last attempt at producing Zelda-like dungeon design. And with any hope, that's a trend the rest of the game's dungeons will follow suit in. But before we can continue on with talking about the level design, there's another aspect of this game that we first need to discuss: the overworld. Because after defeating the Green Choo-Choo and receiving our first element, the player will be forced to make his way back to Hyrule Town and talk to a few NPCs, with the express purpose of introducing some of this game's main side content. So let's take this moment to discuss that side content in full, as well as the overworld this game takes place in. The Minish Cap's world design is very different from that of most other Zelda games, 2D or otherwise, though in some ways it bears the most similarity to Majora's Overworld. Like in that game, Minish Cap hosts its one and only major settlement in the approximate center of the world map, with the rest of the game's few explorable areas branching out from there. This settlement is Hyrule Town, and it's here where a great deal of this game's content, both mandatory and optional, is located. All the minigames, for example, take place within the city walls. There's Simon Simulations, which is just a combat room that throws a bunch of random mobs at the player. It's nothing special or interesting. You do get a heart piece after your first successful clear though, so I guess it has its function, but there's no real reason to come back here after that. There's also a chest guessing minigame, which is super lame. After paying a simple 10 rupee entry fee, you're just presented with 2 treasure chests to guess between, one of which holds nothing and the other doubles your money. You can repeat this process till you get a maximum of 999 rupees, or until you lose, but that's it. There is no prize beyond money, nor is there any strategy to this, so it's literally just gambling for rupees. So neither of those minigames are particularly great, but the third and final one is a bit more interesting. Anju is back to being a cuckoo lady in this game, and just like in her debut appearance, she wants Link to go around town fetching her missing cuckoos for her. The catch this time around is that we're given an arbitrary timer, and the number of cuckoos we have to find and where they're located changes after each attempt. Now, Octo, I hear you say, why would I even attempt this minigame more than once? Is it really that hard? Well, no, it's actually exceedingly easy once you get the hang of it, and the layout only changes after each successful attempt. The reason you'll be doing this minigame more than once is not because it is difficult, but simply because you have to. Only after your 10th and final game will Anju give you your goddamn heart piece. If that sounds boring and repetitive, then that's because it is. It's basically just the same minigame played 10 times over. It really doesn't get any lazier than that. Now, look, I don't want to make it sound like this is a completely unbearable piece of side content, because it really isn't. It's kinda interesting the first time you do it, and some of the retreads will have you use a new item like the Pegasus boots or the flippers in order to more efficiently capture all the necessary cuckoos, but having to repeat the same game 10 goddamn times might have just been a tad bit excessive, that's all I'm saying. I think it wears out its welcome after the 3rd trial at best, so going well beyond that probably wasn't the best decision on Capcom's part. It provides an easy way to grind for rupees in the endgame though, so I guess it has that much going for it. So besides the minigames, what other kind of side content does Hyrule Town host? Well, not much actually. One of my biggest complaints about the Minish Cap in general is that its overworld tends to tantalize players with all sorts of secrets and potential side quests, only to completely block you from engaging with any of this content until hitting a very specific story beat, or even worse, until you fuse the right kinstone. If you're wondering what a kinstone is, then hold on to that thought for just a bit longer, because that's gonna be an entire kerfuffle of its own. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So, on my first playthrough, I decided to do what I always do in Zelda games, and immediately upon entering Hyrule Town for the very first time, decided to explore the settlement and look for side quests and hidden secrets that could help me on my journey. In fact, I would tend to do this on every retread of the area, particularly after acquiring a new dungeon item. On one such occasion, I found a Picori who told me about a secret treasure hidden within the town, one with a legend attached to it. This legend, as told by the Picori, read as such: "Cross the bridge that spans the rapid flow, through the land of the fearsome beast, until you reach the misty falls. The treasure sleeps on the other side of the entrance there." This immediately intrigued me. I always love whenever a Zelda game takes the legend part of its title seriously, and fills out the world design with ancient tales and legends, especially when such legends are attached to tangible pieces of treasure like this one seemed to be. So I investigated my surroundings and pieced together the literal meaning of the legend's many riddles. The bridge that spans the rapid flow was a plank of wood lying over a small stream. The land of the fearsome beast was a pen of hostile cats to weave your way through. And the misty falls was a stone fountain with a small small hole I knew I could enter as a Picori. So, riddle solved. Now I just had to follow the path and make my way towards the treasure. Yes? Well, that's what would happen in a good Zelda game. It would allow the player to follow through on the hints provided by the game world and retrieve the treasure as intended. I mean, that's why the devs placed this NPC out in the game world in the first place, right? Why else would they have him tell the player such an interesting legend unless the devs wanted us to take on this challenge and complete the riddles provided? Well, if that's what you thought, then I'm sorry to say that you're dead wrong. Instead, curious players who attempt to actually engage in this side quest will find themselves entirely unable to complete it, because for some reason, one of the houses you need to pass through in order to reach the fountain is inaccessible at this point in the game. Its owner, Dr. Left, won't let you enter until a very specific point in the main story. This is because, despite the legend being available to hear early into the game, the developers intended for it to actually be a part of a much larger pre-dungeon quest wherein you acquire the power bracelets and use them to retrieve a book. Why? Fuck if I know. The power bracelets aren't that useful, but even if the devs wanted to wait until the mid-game to actually give them to the player, then why did they put an NPC in this game world who tells you this super interesting legend before you're actually able to follow through on it? What is the purpose of this? Why tantalize me with such an interesting piece of what appears to be completely optional content, only for me to be entirely unable to engage with it in any meaningful way? This isn't a one-time mistake, unfortunately. Practically every area of interest within the Minish Cap's overworld, and Hyrule Town specifically, by the way, will be cut off from exploration until a very specific prerequisite is fulfilled by the player. And more often than not, that prerequisite will be, a kinstone. Okay. It's finally time to talk about these things. Kinstones are a brand new type of collectible introduced in The Legend of Zelda, the Minish Cap. The way they work is simple. Players can find kinstone pieces out in the overworld, be that in small grass, as enemy drops, inside chests, or at certain shops within Hyrule Town. There are 8 types of kinstone pieces in total, the most common of which are the 3 green variants, then the 3 red kinds, and finally the 2 blue ones. These pieces only form half a kinstone, however, yet none can fit with each other to form a whole. Instead, several characters out in the overworld will hold the other half of each kinstone with them, and it is these half pieces which can form a whole when fused with the player's own kinstone piece. In other words, the objective is to find kinstone pieces, walk up to NPCs and press the L trigger, and see if they have a matching kinstone piece to fuse with. Should this be the case, then the pieces will converge to create a whole kinstone and cause some sort of effect out in the overworld. This can range from small changes, like a special golden enemy spawning in who can be killed for some extra rupees, or a chest suddenly appearing in an old area, to big ones like entire beanstalks sprouting from the ground and leading to a treasure chest in the sky to collect, or waking up Big Goron so he can give you a shield upgrade, or even advancing through whole side quests like this Goron one that ends in the acquisition of an empty bottle. I think the concept behind these kinstones was simple. Take the trading side quests from earlier games in the series and flesh it out into a game-spanning mechanic that would add extra depth to the side content in this game. If I had to guess, the devs made this decision because they knew the minuscule size of the overworld would make exploration far too simple a task in this game. So by adding an extra step before you can collect your reward, that is, by requiring that we retrieve a kinstone, find the right NPC, then track down the location of our prize before collecting it, then they could stretch out the optional content enough to fill an entire full-length Zelda title. It's an idea, I suppose, but there's one glaring problem with this system that the devs didn't seem to pick up on during development. None of this works in execution. Trading quests in past Zelda games were already treading a thin fucking line. The only positive they had going for them was the way they would force players to familiarize themselves with and endear themselves to the characters of each respective game. This worked best in Ocarina of Time, secondly in Link's Awakening, and then never again because both Majora and the Wind Waker failed to attach any actual character writing to their respective trading quest lines. As a consolation though, they were at least very short quests with plenty of worthwhile rewards waiting at the end. The kinstones, by contrast, achieve the exact opposite result. They make up the vast supermajority of all the Minish Cap side content. That is not a joke. Kinstones seriously are the prerequisite to practically every single secret and side quest in this game, and yet they in no way connect to the story or character writing in even the slightest. It's never even explained what a kinstone is, much less why they cause incredible things to happen, or how so many characters in the overworld just so happen to have one on hand. What they are, in reality, is a bunch of inexplicable MacGuffins used to gate off progress towards completing this game's side content. That's the only purpose. Seriously, what's the difference between finding a kinstone piece, walking up to an NPC, fusing kinstones with him or her, then traveling to a now revealed clearing in a tree line you passed 5 hours earlier into your adventure in order to then open a chest containing a heart piece, and just solving a puzzle using a new dungeon item in order to retrieve said heart piece? I'll tell you the difference: 20 minutes of your goddamn life. The kinstone fusion in and of itself adds absolutely nothing of substance to any of these side quests or collectibles, other than the potential for some grinding, since you can't always guarantee that you'll have the necessary kinstone piece to fuse with. Green kinstone pieces in particular are used up a lot in this game, so I'd often find myself purchasing several of these anytime I'd stop into town over the course of my later playthroughs. And you know what? That's all bad enough as is, but there's a much bigger problem with these things that I haven't even mentioned here yet. How the fuck are you supposed to know which characters you're supposed to fuse kinstones with? See, in past Zelda trading sequences, a large part of the experience was the process of deducing, through logic, who the next target in a trading questline would be. In Link's Awakening, for example, the Yoshi doll had to be given to a mother asking specifically for a Yoshi doll. Super simple. Then the bow could be given to a Chomp Chomp who wanted to accessorize, then the dog food would go to Kale the canned food collector, then his bananas would pass to Kiki the monkey, and on the list would go. That's kind of the whole appeal to this kind of quest in the first place, isn't it? To piece together the clues and find which items go to which NPCs? So then tell me, how the fuck am I, or any other player for that matter, supposed to deduce that by fusing a kinstone with a random Bakori in the far off corner of the Minish village, then exiting his house, then re-entering, I can fuse with him a second time in order to spawn a random patch of dirt in front of a cave in the Vale Falls on the opposite end of the map, thus allowing me to dig my way into said cave and find a heart piece waiting inside? That's a trick question. There is no answer. I would not only have to find this random nameless Bakori and fuse with him in the first place, but I would then have to deduce through divine fucking revelation, as far as I can tell, since there's no logical way to come to this conclusion, that I can then fuse with him a second time after exiting and re-entering his house, just in the vague hope that it will lead to a potential heart piece. Nothing about the kinstone system is intuitive, fun, or creative in even the slightest. It's just blatant padding, and it's honestly the most video gamey thing I've ever seen put into a Zelda game up until this point. And I mean that in the most insulting way possible. I get that a lot of aspects of Zelda games, and video games in general, can have exclusive video game logic to them that doesn't really fit into real-world intuition whatsoever. But putting a bunch of colorful stones into your game that inexplicably appear throughout the game world and are said to bring happiness to people through completely unexplained fusions is perhaps the greatest offender of unintuitive video game logic in the entire Zelda series up until Skyward Sword, where Fujibayashi somehow found a way to phone things in even more by creating a set of collectibles literally called Gratitude Crystals.
To Elden Volcano!
What's in it for me?
You will receive 5 Gratitude Crystals.
Are you fucking serious?
Yeah.
That sounds like a parody. That sounds like what a Family Guy would do if they made like a made-up video game achievement.
All right. So, the kinstones are, by all reasonable definitions, an abject failure. That's no small problem, obviously, but what about the rest of this game's collectibles? Well, that somehow gets even worse. Let's get the less painful of the two out of the way, the heart pieces. These are a returning set of collectibles, and always quite welcome, but many of them are unfortunately tied directly to kinstone fusion this time around, and as such, are complete garbage. Again, grinding for consumables, walking up to every single NPC in the game, and trading multiple times just to find the exact fusion you need to acquire all this game's heart pieces is not exactly my idea of a good time. There is no thinking nor skill required to do any of this. It's just just a fucking time vampire. But as for the rest, there is a decent mix of classically hidden pieces of heart here that could fit well into any other Zelda title, like this one in Hyrule Town, tucked away in a back room of the inn. You can become Bikori-sized, slip into a small mouse-sized hole hidden in the back of this building, and return to human form in order to collect the piece of heart. Or this other one you can find near the end of the game, hidden inside the town bell. Once you get the rock cape, you can jump straight into it and knock the heart piece onto the ground. This is a particularly neat one, because there are a few NPCs throughout the game who will have talked about the good luck this bell is said to impart upon those who hear it ring. Another plot element lifted straight out of Chrono Trigger, by the way. So for there to be an actual heart piece hidden inside the bell this entire time is actually pretty cool, and definitely subtle, since it's information you'd have to pay attention to and recall by the end of the game in order to figure out. Another big plus are the 5 heart pieces hidden in the game's main dungeons, which is a first for the series, and I honestly think that putting heart pieces inside dungeons is a great way to incentivize backtracking and exploration. Couldn't be any more pleased with the way these are executed. But unfortunately, for as many well-hidden or expertly placed pieces of heart as you can find in this game, there are at least twice as many duds out there which offset them. Obviously, as previously mentioned, all the ones tied to kinstone pieces suck, but even excluding those, a great many heart pieces just sort of sit out in the open in this game, with no challenge or barrier to entry in even the slightest. Take this one sitting just outside Deepwood Shrine, for example. There is no riddle to solve here, no puzzle or clever use of dungeon items to reach it. All you have to do is walk up to the shrine, which is mandatory by the way, and bam, you get the heart piece. Similarly, there's another one located in the Minish village that's just sitting on a dock right out in the open. Another example, at Vale Falls, there's a heart piece that is just sitting there, unattended to, with no guards or puzzles protecting it in even the slightest. And inside several of the dojos you'll find throughout the game world, there's just heart pieces sitting inside, no challenge required. Then there's this other heart piece in the Minish Woods, again, just sitting there waiting for the taking, and in Lake Hylia, there's another heart piece you can just swim to. Not a difficult feat to accomplish, mind you, granted that the player can only reach this part of the map after learning how to swim, so it might as well just be sitting on the side of a dirt road for all intents and purposes. I could go on rattling off more examples, but I think you get the point. Simple or otherwise badly designed piece of heart placement is the norm in the Minish Cap, and this is far from a small problem. But the real coup de grace, the final death blow that absolutely kills any chance this game had at hosting fun side content, comes from the final piece of heart, which, conveniently, is also tied to the third and final set of collectibles present in this game, the mysterious seashells. First, it needs to be acknowledged that yes, these things are named after their Link's Awakening counterparts, but despite the etymological similarities, they do not operate under the same rules. Whereas the secret seashells from Link's Awakening were few in number, 26 in total, only 20 of which you needed to collect in order to retrieve your prize, and were finite, the mysterious seashells in the Minish Cap are numerous, with an inventory cap of 999 in total, and technically infinite, as they drop from enemies, tall grass, and can even be bought at the Hyrule Town shop. In other words, they act more like a currency than actual collectibles in this game. Okay, so what can this currency be traded in for? Dungeon items? Heart pieces? Lamp oil? Rope? Bombs? Nope. It's none of the above. Instead, the seashells only have one specific function in this game: to be used as currency with which to play a fucking slot machine. What's the prize? Little figurines of all the characters and places present throughout the game. That's it. This honestly feels entirely disconnected from the rest of the game. I don't get it. It not only doesn't fit in with the game world in any meaningful way, because how or why this one guy is just carving a bunch of figurines of every enemy and NPC in this game is beyond me, but it's also completely functionless. Sure, some of the statues reveal little backstory tidbits about certain characters. That fact I mentioned earlier into the video about Zelda liking Link but wishing he were more manly, that comes from one of the final figurines you can earn from this place. But not only is revealing character information in this way kinda lazy, it also just isn't very engaging. I would much rather discover information about characters through interesting dialogue, cutscenes, and most optimally of all, through gameplay, rather than through some optional figurines I have to play a game of chance to earn. It doesn't help that the way you earn these figurines is entirely asinine. One shell equals one pull. Okay, simple enough, except the chances of acquiring a new figurine get lower with each successful pull, meaning that your first go around will guarantee a 100% chance at getting a new figurine, but your second will go down to a 99% chance, then to 98, then 97, and on it goes. So while you'll start off racking up new figurines rapidly, eventually your chances will bottom out and you'll be pulling over and over again just to get the next one. But not to fear, because by adding in more seashells, you can increase your chances of getting a new figurine by 1% per additional shell, meaning that if you want to increase your 90% chance of receiving a new figurine to 100%, you need to add in an additional 10 shells. If you're not great at math, that might not have immediately set off alarm bells in your head, so let me break down the numbers for you. A 90% chance of receiving a new figurine for the cost of 1 shell is pretty good odds, and cheap too. You're incredibly likely to earn your figurine on a first try, and if not, almost guaranteed to get it by your second. So that's a total cost of 1 to 2 seashells per figurine. Pretty cheap. But what if you wanted to increase your chances to 100%, just in case you had some bad luck? Well, then you'll need to insert 11 shells in total, 1 for the initial pull, then another 10 for each percentage point after that. So, to put it more simply, you could spend 11 seashells in order to pull for a statue with a 100% chance of success, or spend the same amount pulling 11 times, but with a 90% chance of success for each pull. Again, if you're decent at math, you probably just facepalmed realizing how utterly stupid it would be to spend 11 seashells on 1 pull instead of just putting in a singular seashell over and over again. Because there's a 99% chance that you'll get the figurine after only spending 2 seashells, and a 99.9% chance you'll get it with 3 seashells. For the 11 seashell cost to be worth it, you would have to lose a 90% pull 11 times in a row, which amounts to an astronomically low 0.00000000001% chance of failure. In other words, it's statistically impossible for your 11 seashell investment to be more effective than just pulling for your figurine 1 seashell at a time. Even if you miss the first, or God forbid, the second chance at getting a figurine, you're bound to get it by the 3rd try, and that'll only cost you 3 seashells total. With odds like that, why the fuck would anyone spend more than 1 seashell at a time? These seashells don't come easy. If you run out, you're gonna have to grind for them. So of course the player will want to be as efficient with them as humanly possible. In fact, the only time that dumping additional seashells into a single pull will ever statistically match the efficiency of inserting 1 at a time is when you get down to a 1% success rate. Because spending 101 seashells at once is only a fraction of a percentage less likely to save you seashells than pulling for a 1% chance 101 times would. And by that point, you don't have any more figurines to go for, so what are you even saving your seashells for? So, okay, what does all this math actually mean in practice? Well, it means that if you want to get all 130 figurines in this game, you'll need to pull for each and every one by one at a time, over and over again, and pray to God that the RNG just so happens to be on your side, spamming through the figurine seller's dialogue all the while, physically pulling on the lever each time. And no, it is not as simple as just tapping the A button over and over again. You have to actually pick dialogue choices and move Link around in order to do it. It's boring. If you're trying to be as efficient as possible with your seashells, then you'll eventually get to a point where you're just pulling and pulling for the same low percentage chance figurines over and over again until finally dumping all your seashells right at the very end. God forbid you don't figure this strategy out early enough into the game and accidentally dump your seashells all at once, because then you'll be forced to grind for them all in the end game. Now hold on a second, Octo, I hear some of you ask. Why are you even forcing yourself to do any of this in the first place? In fact, why would I or any other player want to engage in such an asinine and meaningless activity like the one you're describing? Aren't you just doing this to yourself? That's a very great question, Mr. Strawman. Boy, am I glad to have you around. You always ask the best questions at the most convenient times for me, don't you? Well, you're right. This figurine side quest is completely asinine, absolutely stupid, and an abject failure by every conceivable measure. So why would a player want to engage in it? Well, I'll show you why. See my heart count? 19 hearts. And looking at my menu, I've got 3 pieces of heart too. Now, where is that final piece of heart? The one I so desperately crave, so that I might 100% this game and make my Link as powerful as possible. And better yet, what does this question have to do with the figurines I was just talking about? Oh no. Yep, if you haven't already guessed it, the prize for collecting all 130 figurines is this game's final piece of heart. This entire side quest, one that spans the entire game and requires hours of grinding, patience, and pulling the same goddamn lever over and over again for a decreasingly smaller and smaller percentage chance of winning a stupid digital figurine you didn't even care about in the first place, is all done in the pursuit of a a singular piece of heart. So yeah, there is that. Remember my Oracle Games review where I stated that the Maple Heart piece, you know, that shitty one that only had a 1% chance to drop and could take up minutes, if not hours of your life, was the second worst heart piece in the entire Legend of Zelda series? Well, this is the worst. This is the one I've been building up to this entire series of Zelda reviews. And you know what's funny about it? I actually thought to myself for a brief moment on my second playthrough of this game that maybe I was wrong. When I was pulling for those first 20 or so figurines, things went by quick and I thought, nah, this isn't as bad as Maple, I guess. But then my chances kept dropping and dropping and dropping as I spent an increasing amount of seconds, minutes, hours pulling for the same stupid figurines over and over and over again. There's no defending this, I'm sorry. Even Maple's heart piece was tied to a character I actually liked, and the little mini game of racing against her as you run to retrieve the piece of heart had some intensity behind it. It gave some sort of meaning to the act, even if it was frustrating to grind for the heart piece for half an hour only for Maple to suck it up with her vacuum and fly off into the night. By contrast, nothing about these figurines works. The seashells aren't fun to collect, the figurines themselves don't provide any tangible benefits, the entire concept of this vendor and his occupation doesn't fit in with the world or its story in even the slightest, but worst of all, it's such a fucking bore. That's the worst part about it. It's just plain boring. This is easily the worst piece of side content ever put in a Zelda game. Yes, the Breath of the Wild era has its Korok seeds. Yes, I'll be shitting on those endlessly, and Tears of the Kingdom especially is going to get ripped apart for how it handled that. But at least the Korok seeds are fun for a little while. At least they provide tangible rewards as you collect them. The Minish Cap and its stupid figurine side quest couldn't even do that much. So, in conclusion, what can be said about the Minish Cap's overworld and side content? The short answer is, it's bad. The slightly longer answer is, it's a minuscule overworld that somehow fails to pack interesting or meaningful content within that small size because it was too interested in offloading the main bulk of that work to a Kinstone trading sequence that is so disconnected from the game world and uninteresting to engage in that it becomes more of a chore than an actually fun mechanic. And the game's longest spanning side quest is so stupidly chance-based, repetitive, and uncreative that it ends up being one of the worst things I've ever seen put into a Zelda game, or honestly, into any video game in general. Even though Wind Waker had better overworld content than this. Yeah, the sailing could get dragged out and the characters were generally uninteresting, but at least a few of the quests were sorta okay. At least a minigame or two could impress me every once in a while. The Minish Cap, by contrast, is a complete failure in this regard. Alright. Well, now that we've established that the Minish Cap side content all pretty much sucks, let's get back to discussing the main quest and hope things get better from there. Our next stop is Mount Crenal, located to the northwest of Hyrule Town, and it is here where we are to seek out two separate yet deeply interconnected end goals. First, a Picori blacksmith named Malari is said to dwell at the summit of the mountain, and it is he who will be able to repair our Picori blade. Second, the next element we need to repair said blade is also, quite conveniently, located at the top of the mountain, so we'll be able to kill two birds with one stone here. The climb up the mountain highlights a rather interesting aspect of the Minish Cap's world design. Rather than an open area to explore, Mount Crenal and the other key locations in this game act as a sort of mini dungeon unto themselves, presenting puzzles, traversal challenges, and combat encounters all within a mostly linear path to follow. Like I mentioned earlier, this design choice is mostly reminiscent of the way Majora's Mask structured its overworld. But while Majora's four main biomes each had their own interesting side quests, secret areas, and hidden content to explore that would call the player back to them well into the endgame, each of the areas present in the Minish Cap feel much more disposable in contrast, since, again, there's very little side content to engage in outside of the Kinstone system. But as for the actual level design on offer here, I must admit, it's not too bad. We're given the bomb bag as soon as we exit the Minish Woods, which won't see much use immediately, but when climbing Mount Crenal, it'll become invaluable, as cracked walls and rocks block your path and hide important tunnels from view. There are puzzles utilizing the Minish form as well, where the player will have to shrink in size to get past certain rocky areas, while introducing new obstacles like raindrops, which will hit like a boulder to the Picori-sized Link. There are also a few optional caves to find as you climb, which are hidden behind bombable walls that aren't telegraphed with normal cracks, but instead by suspicious landmarks and signs that hint at their presence. It's a decent bit of level design, teaching the mechanics of the bomb bag while providing providing a fun gauntlet of challenges to run through. Upon reaching the summit, the player can find Malari and give him the Picori sword, which the blacksmith will promise to repair for us in exchange for nothing. His reasoning for doing so is, and I quote, that he loves all this adventure, what with the rescuing of princesses and such. Okay, two things. First, you're doing none of the adventuring, Malari, so I don't understand what you're actually getting out of this. Second, how the fuck do you run a business if you just give away your labor for free to every hero who passes by your shop? It's a small plot point and not one that matters too much, but I wish we actually had to do something to earn Malari's labor here. It's far less interesting when characters simply acknowledge the player as an unfailing hero and help him on his quest for nothing in return. It's just lazy storytelling. Well, regardless, with the Picori sword dropped off, we can now finally move on to this game's second dungeon, the Cave of Flames. Following in series tradition, this second level is our token fire-themed dungeon, though it has elements of an abandoned mining shaft mixed in as well, since the in-game lore states that it used to be a joint Hylian Picori ore mine back in the day. The first floor starts off with a simple 4-room layout. The player will have to head east and encounter a combat room full of bob-ombs, enemies who will run around the room and explode the moment you hit them. Then the next room carries 2 spiked beetles, returning enemies from the Game Boy titles, who have to be upended with your shield before striking them with the sword. In the final room is a rupee-like, a new kind of like who will eat Link's rupees rather than a shield. These new enemies aren't substantially difficult, but they do introduce new challenges compared to the simple hack and slashing we've done up until this point. From here, we can head down to the first basement floor, and it's at this point that I need to bring up one rather grating issue I have with the dungeons in the Minish Cap, and that is Ezlo. So, as I mentioned back in the Minish Woods, Ezlo serves as our guide character for this game, and following series tradition, that means that his job is to chime in whenever he's needed in order to explain necessary tutorial information or story exposition. At least, that's how he's supposed to act in concept. See, the problem with guide characters, and why they tend to be a taboo subject for more modern Zelda titles, is that they are, by their very nature, a tacit admittance by the developers that they couldn't figure out how to convey all their game's information to players without flat out telling them. This was forgivable in the case of Ocarina of Time because, one, that was the first 3D action-adventure game ever made, so obviously there was a large learning curve to overcome for players and the developers both, and two, the devs found a way to actually integrate that game's guide character into the story and gameplay quite seamlessly, as Navi was both an active participant in the plot and the cursor we'd use to lock on to enemies. Remove her from Ocarina of Time and you would have a vastly inferior game on your hands. That doesn't mean she couldn't have yapped a little less, and I would have preferred to have an option to disable most of her advice on a repeat playthrough, but she was still a really solid first attempt at the concept. Meanwhile, Majora's Mask and The Wind Waker pretty much sidelined their respective guide characters throughout each of those respective games' runtimes, so they weren't much of an annoyance, even if I hate the King of Red Lions for destroying Hyrule, but that's a separate issue. Ezlo, by contrast, doesn't fit into either of these two categories. Instead, not only does he tend to communicate information to the player that is ridiculously obvious and unnecessary, but he also does so incessantly and without any way to make him stop. And this dungeon in particular is the perfect example of that. For instance, the moment you enter the cave, he will immediately interrupt the gameplay by saying, "Wow, it's hot in here. Come on, let's not stand around wasting time." This means nothing to us, because in no way is the heat an actual game mechanic to pay attention to the way it was in, say, Ocarina of Time. But it gets worse, because the moment you enter the dungeon's third room, the one with the spiked beetles in it, he says, "Your sword won't make a dent in their armor. Flip them over before you strike." Okay, that's useful information, I suppose, but I feel like this is something that players should have to figure out for themselves. You know, the way you're supposed to figure out the weaknesses of every other enemy in this game. I mean, previous Zelda titles function just fine without guide characters interrupting the gameplay to give away enemy weaknesses every 5 seconds, so why do that here? But that's not even the end of things. Once you enter the first lava room, Ezlo will say, "Oh my, it looks really, really hot in that lava. Trust me, falling into that would be a bad idea. I'm sure you agree." Yeah, no shit, Ezlo. Of course it would be a bad idea. Of course it's fucking hot. It's lava. Children understand that lava's hot. Why the fuck are you telling me any of this? Who is this line of dialogue written for? What the fuck is this character's purpose? I could go on. Trust me, I really could, but I think you get the point. Ezlo's advice is far too frequent in this dungeon, as well as in every level beyond this point too. It just gets grating after a while, and unfortunately, as you'll come to see soon enough, his character writing simply isn't good enough to make up for any of this. But moving on with the dungeon itself. Upon entering the first basement floor, the Cave of Flames will finally introduce its main gimmick, minecarts. The player can jump in these and use them to zoom down a preordained set of tracks to reach areas otherwise inaccessible by foot. Honestly, compared to the depth these things had in the Oracle games, they're far less interesting here. No other dungeon in this game utilizes or builds off of them in even the slightest, and they move too fast to shoot projectiles out of as well, the way you could in the past games. They're more cinematic in nature, which is fine, but I would have preferred if the devs had crafted interesting puzzles with these things instead. After the cart ride, the player will eventually end up in a lava room hosting a little platforming challenge. There are little rocky platforms floating in the magma, which will crumble away only seconds after walking over them. The player will have to quickly run over each platform without falling into the deadly liquid below, or else he'll be forced to start from the beginning all over again. After this comes a little block pushing puzzle, which will reward a small key used to open a door located back in the minecart room. This brings us to a switch that will shift the tracks around, bringing the player to a brand new room in the dungeon's northern wing. Here, the player will run into a turned over minecart, currently inoperable, but the tracks it once rolled down can at least be traversed on foot. This brings us to the mini-boss, the spiny choo-choos? Plural? Yeah, this is a pretty lame one. Basically, it's just a horde of 8 choo-choos who can turn into metal spiky balls when you swipe at them. The solution is to simply wait till they exit their invulnerable state and strike them with your sword. That's it, that's the fight. It's incredibly lazy, and while it does stand out amongst all the other mini-boss fights in this game for recycling normal enemies during what's supposed to be an important battle, it does, unfortunately, begin a rather terrible trend with this game's mini-boss fights, as you'll no doubt come to see as we continue with the video. Killing the choo-choos will net the Kanepachi, a magic rod that has the power to flip things over. Yep, that's all it does. Well, that, and you can also shoot its magic power into small holes and use them to launch Link into the air. I don't know why this out-of-place secondary function exists, it just sort of does. Still, we can use this newfound power to flip over the upside-down minecart we ran into earlier, ride it to a chest containing a small key, and use that to make our way down to the second basement floor. From here, the player will have to turn into a Picori once again and dodge some human-sized traps, which becomes exceedingly difficult with such a small stature. It's a neat way of using the Picori form to look at normal parts of the Zelda game world in a brand new light. This leads to another minecart section, then a block pushing puzzle, and finally, to one last lava room with quite the difficult platforming challenges to overcome. The player will have to ride moving platforms across the lava, not staying on them for too long lest they crumble to dust, while using the Kanepachi to flip over upside down platforms all the while. It ends up getting pretty intense, since the planning ahead you'll have to do in the room's later sections gets pretty advanced. It's a good way to combine the dungeon's many varying mechanics all into one final challenge. The boss fight waiting at the end of this gauntlet really caps things off quite well though. It's a returning enemy, but presented in a brand new light. Gleerock, a dragon with a turtle-like shell of volcanic stone protecting its back. The creature sits in a vast lake of lava at the center of a square-shaped room, and will shoot fireballs at the player from a distance. This leaves the Gleerock entirely invulnerable to your attacks, but by getting around him and aiming the Kanepachi at his shell, the rock will turn upside down and smack against the monster's back, causing his long neck to crash down into the floor in front of him. The player can then use this opportunity to climb onto the creature from the front and stab at his body, before he recovers and retreats into the lava. The pattern is simple in concept, but a couple factors complicate this fight. First, the environment will become a major obstacle, as the Gleerock causes lava levels to rise and rocks to fall from the ceiling the moment he retreats from your attacks. Second, his fireballs will actually create walls of flames on the boss room floor, and he'll even shoot massive barrages of attacks that will completely cut off whole sections of the room from being traversed. You can use the Gust Jar we acquired from the last dungeon to clear these flames, but that'll leave you vulnerable, so it's a risk-reward situation no matter how you look at it. It's a fantastic fight, definitely a highlight of this game, that's for sure. All in all, the Cave of Flames is what I would call a serviceable second dungeon. It really isn't anything special. As far as atmosphere, music, level design, puzzle solving, and even combat encounters go, nothing about the dungeon really stands out, excepting its final boss, of course. But there also isn't anything particularly bad about it either. It's a middle-of-the-road, completely acceptable dungeon design. Inoffensive, but unlikely to stick in the player's mind for very long either. True, not every dungeon in a Zelda game can be a 10 out of 10, but given the relatively small number of dungeons that this game hosts, the Minish Cap can't afford to have very many duds, unfortunately. After completing the dungeon, the player can return to Malari and receive from him the White Sword, a repaired version of the Picori blade that does slightly more damage than our previous weapon. But in order to infuse the sword with its rightful magical properties, we'll need to head back to Hyrule Castle and enter a hidden chamber called the Elemental Sanctuary, a place said to be the bridge between the worlds of the Picori and the people of Hyrule. It is here where we acquire the ability to split Link into 2 copies, allowing us to solve certain puzzles we couldn't before. The chamber teaches this mechanic immediately by locking its main entrance behind us, with the only way to open it being to press down 2 pressure plates at once. To do that, the player will have to find a special set of colored tiles that'll allow Link to split in half, and then walk both copies over to the pressure plates. It's a simple concept, but one that will be effectively utilized utilized in several puzzles and combat encounters to come. But before we can get to any of that, Vaati shows up to taunt us, or more specifically, to taunt Eslo, whom he calls his former master. So of course, Eslo decides that Link is owed an explanation, leading to our first major bit of story exposition. According to Eslo, he is, in actuality, a Bokori, and also considered to be one of the greatest magicians and craftsmen of his kind. Vaati was his apprentice, until one day, the young boy got his hands on a cap that Eslo had made for humans, meant to fulfill the wishes of whomever wore it. Vaati used the cap to become the greatest sorcerer in the world, and turned those powers on Eslo immediately, transforming him into the green cap we see him as today. And that's it. That's the whole story. Not much to it, but it does leave us with more questions than answers. For one, Eslo tells us that he was making this hat for human use, which is in line with the general purpose of the Bokori as a race. They live to make human lives easier, be that by making shoes for them, placing kinstones in tall grass, or creating magical artifacts to assist them in times of need, like the Bokori blade itself. The problem is that it's never explained why the Bokori do this. They were not created by the goddesses or some other divine force to act on the Hylians' behalf, nor do they receive any material benefit from their assistance either, so why do they go out of their way to make such powerful artifacts for humans in the first place? And second, Eslo claims that Vaati was, quote, enchanted by the wickedness in the hearts of men, and that's why he became so enamored by the cap and the power it could grant him. This presents two main problems. First, I cannot find a single instance of any human being in this video game acting in a way that is selfish, evil, or otherwise amoral. In fact, Vaati is the only sentient being in this game that ever acts with malice. So although I can understand, conceptually, what kind of evil lurks in the hearts of men, based on my own real-life experiences, the complete absence of any such malicious characters in the Minish Cap makes me question who or what exactly tempted Vaati into villainy. Second, if humans really are capable of such evils, then why the fuck would Eslo make them a hat capable of granting any wish that one desires? Isn't that incredibly dangerous and irresponsible? Eslo states that it was his pride that led him to this outcome, but pride in what? What about his personality or character history convinced him that making this hat was a good idea? Well, we'll never get an answer to that, because spoilers, Eslo doesn't have a backstory. He does not exist beyond the events of this game and how they relate to Vaati. How or why Eslo himself became such a great sorcerer or where his pride comes from is never explained. All that's bad enough, but the game actually isn't done with its story exposition quite yet. After exiting Hyrule Town, Link will suddenly stop as Eslo comments that he senses something coming from the direction of the castle, which the game uses as an excuse to shift perspectives. We're suddenly shown a cutscene taking place in Hyrule Castle's throne room, in which the King of Hyrule is confronted by Vaati, and presumably done away with in one form or another. The next day, Vaati, now disguised as the King of Hyrule, orders all of the kingdom's soldiers to seek out the Light Force, you know, the magical MacGuffin he's been searching for this whole time, and the soldiers, none the wiser, follow his command. Our perspective then shifts back to Link, and Eslo's all like, must have been the wind, on with the show. So, this cutscene's a bit of a mess. First of all, it's completely unnecessary. The castle soldiers being ordered to find the Light Force is a plot point that goes nowhere, so there wasn't even a reason for any of this to happen in the first place. But even if you wanted to replace the King of Hyrule with Vaati for some reason, wouldn't it have been more interesting for the player to not know about that? To deduce through dialogue and gameplay that something might have happened to him? Because from Link and Eslo's perspective, nothing has actually happened here. The game had to shift from a first-person narrative to a third-person omniscient one just to convey this information to us. And it did it in the messiest way possible. So why did this happen? What is the intention of this scene? Well, this is a writing quirk unique to the Capcom series of Zelda games, which I, personally, have come to call a Fujibayashiism. A Fujibayashiism is when a first-person narrative suddenly and jarringly shifts to a third-person perspective following the story's main villain with the express purpose of showcasing an underhanded aspect of said villain's evil plan. This happened back in Oracle of Ages, if you'll recall, with Ferran. The player brought Queen Ambi some scent seeds in exchange for a bomb bag, only for the camera to stick on the scene well after Link left the castle in order to show our villain mockingly laughing about her evil plot and how she is now one step closer to getting what she wants. And just the same, here in the Minish Cap, we've suddenly shifted to Vaati's perspective in order to show that he now has the castle castle under his control and has gotten closer in his search for the Light Force. In both cases, Hidemaru Fujibayashi, the lead writer, intends to use this sudden barrage of information to increase the story tension and make the player feel as though time is running out. So what's the problem with a Fujibayashiism? Well, first off, it's lazy. Instead of finding a way to communicate this information through gameplay, or even a cutscene from our protagonist's perspective, we instead are being pulled out of Link's body and being shown information which he does not yet know. In other words, we, the player, know the King of Hyrule has been kidnapped and is being impersonated by Vaati, but Link, the character, does not. This is terrible because the whole point of Link as a character is to act as a bridge between our world and the game world. It's quite literally in his name. Link. His power is our power. His courage is our courage. And his wisdom is our wisdom. If we're suddenly being pulled away from his perspective and are being told information which Link, the character, isn't supposed to know, then it causes a major disconnect between the player and Link. Say what you want about Breath of the Wild, but it goes through painstaking lengths to uphold the connection between an amnesiac Link and a player who could have easily been told through cutscenes or dialogue all the information our protagonist doesn't yet have. That game made sure that whatever information players learned over the course of the story would be conveyed to them through Link's eyes, and only his eyes. Because telling stories the way that Fujibayashi likes to write them tends to lead to this kind of dissonance. Gamers should never have to second guess what kind of information their own player avatar does or does not know, because it severs that ever so important link between the protagonist and the player. Now, I will say this much. I in no way believe the Minish Cap to be some god-awful, painful story to sit through the way Wind Waker or the Oracle games were. Hell, even the history bitches from A Link to the Past were more chatty and boring than Ezlo ever is, and Vaati never reaches the same kind of irritation that Varan brought me. I'm simply pointing out that this story isn't really that good. It's below average at best, and feels as though it wasn't thought out that much beyond its most surface level plot points. It's a negative aspect of this game, for sure, and has its issues that should not be ignored, but it's far from being especially irritating or game ruining. Bad storytelling aside, our next stop is the Castor Wilds, a marshy land to the southwest. But as we soon find out, this land is currently impassable. Any attempt at walking in the marshy soil will result in Link sinking into the mud, completely blocking off any attempt we might make to progress. So what gives? Well, Ezlo tells us that we just straight up can't do anything, and so we'll be forced to go all the way back to Hyrule Town in order to find a way to overcome this obstacle. This leads to a little side quest where you'll have to visit the town cobbler, only to find that the man has fallen asleep at his desk with little Picori trying to finish his work. They tell us that they're currently working on a pair of Pegasus boots, which we can use to advance through the marshes, but that the cobbler will have to be woken up in order to put the finishing touches on them. But for some reason, we can't just shake him awake like a normal person. Instead, the player will now have to head all the way back to the Minish Woods in order to acquire a forest mushroom from a lone hag, and use that to wake him up. If you couldn't already tell from that description, this quest is totally asinine and completely unengaging. If I'm being honest though, I don't even think I'd hate it that much if we could just do it at any time. But for some reason, even if the player is curious enough to enter this shop at an earlier part of the game, you just can't do it yet. The cobbler only falls asleep once you reach a very specific trigger in the story. You have to go to Castor Wilds, fall into the marsh, and then be told by Ezlo that you can't yet progress. So even if you're replaying the game and already know that you can't pass through the swamp without first acquiring the Pegasus boots, you still have to be told this information by Ezlo, and then waddle your ass all the way back to town for no other reason than that the developers are forcing you to do so. I do not understand this choice in even the slightest, and it highlights the point I made earlier about the Minish Cap's god-awful progression. Why are hyper-specific story triggers being used to gate off quests like this? It would be fine if I could just head to the Minish Woods and buy the mushroom after acquiring the Cane of Pachi or the White Sword, but having to wait for a character to do a thing or to move out of the way once I finally trigger a highly specific line of dialogue feels cheap and hand-holding in a way rarely seen in the Zelda series up until this point. In fact, it's starting to remind me of the way Wind Waker handled its overworld progression. And for those of you who saw my review on that game, I'm sure you know just how bad an insult that is. It's not like there's even much of anything interesting about this quest all on its own. The only obstacle is a locked house on the way to the Minish Woods that you'll have to open from the inside, using the Picori form to shrink down, enter a mouse hole, and pop out the other side to retrieve a spare key. It wouldn't even be special except for the fact that the owners of the house are Malon and Talon. But because this game is set inexplicably far in the past from the previous ones, it's not the actual Malon and Talon, just characters who share their names, occupations, and character designs. Had these NPCs possessed their own unique looks and names, there would have been no need to even mention them, because their appearance in this game is meaningless. That's how bare bones his quest is. Regardless, once we return from the Minish Woods with the mushroom, the cobbler will be woken up by its stench and put the finishing touches on the Pegasus boots, which he gives to us for free. What the fuck? Why does every NPC in this game just give us the fruits of his or her labor for free? The blacksmith gives away swords, the cobbler gives away shoes. What's next? Is the library gonna just give away their books? Anyways, I think you get the point. It's a dumb quest, from the writing to the gameplay to the way you have to trigger very specific story requirements to even do it in the first place. Still, our reward is substantial. The Pegasus boots, like in all the past games, allow Link to sprint at lightning speeds, and we can use this newfound power not only to zoom across the overworld faster than before, but to also make our way through the swampy marshes of the Castor Wilds. This section's interesting because, like Mount Crenal before it, the Castor Wilds presents several puzzles and mini challenges revolving around a singular dungeon item. But unlike Mount Crenal, this dungeon item is not a previously acquired one, but rather a new addition to our arsenal, the bow, which can be found in a small cave to the northwest. With this bow, the player will have to navigate around the wilds and find 3 special kinstone pieces, which will act as keys to open the way towards the Wind Ruins. The obstacles to our progress are few but substantial. Igors, returning enemies from the previous games, who you'll have to shoot in the eye in order to kill, and in one case, a brand new mini-boss, the Dark Nut, who, despite taking on the form of his Wind Waker counterpart, provides an incredibly dynamic and interesting battle. You have to actually dodge his attacks and hit him with incredible speed, or block with your shield at just the right times to stun him. Compared to the button prompt bullshit from the last game, this is definitely a big step up. I honestly think the combat in general is quite a high point for this game. It's definitely not the hardest 2D Zelda title in existence, but the battles can definitely be tough at times. After gathering all 3 kinstones, the player can then move on to the Wind Ruins, said to be the abandoned civilization of a people once known as the Wind Tribe. The architecture is unique, but the most interesting landmark of all is the Armos. Again, another returning foe from past games, but this time around, they actually have some pretty unique lore attached to them. See, some of the Armoses remain deactivated and cannot be moved or stirred to life as is, but by shrinking in size and talking to a nearby Bokori hermit, we'll learn that the Armoses were actually invented by the Bokori as a gift for mankind, used to fend off any intruders into their territory. Though it is not outright said, this bit of background lore hints at the solution to our current conundrum. Enter the Armos as a Bokori, and you'll find a control switch that'll turn the automaton back on, allowing us to fight and kill it for good. The puzzles and combat encounters utilizing these things are quite nice, but I especially like the way this builds on the lore. Again, it's established that the Bokori gifted mankind with weapons meant to fight the monsters of yore, the principal among those being the Bokori Blade and the Light Force. But it's interesting to look upon these automatons and think that there were likely many attempts, failures and successes both, to find ways to assist the humans before the Bokori finally created their ultimate weapons. It's a nice way to communicate more subtle parts of the story through both the gameplay and the environment, and that's honestly a really nice change of pace from the way Fujibayashi tends to write his stories. Lying at the end of these ruins is this game's 3rd dungeon, the Fortress of Winds, our first, and unfortunately only, non-linear level design in the Minish Cap. The dungeon opens up by presenting 5 paths, with the 2 on both ends being currently inaccessible, while the 3 middle rooms all lead to different sections of the dungeon's 2nd floor. You can enter these rooms in any order you please, though the middle one does lead to a 2-pronged hallway that'll require a couple small keys to navigate. So, in reality, you can either choose to tackle the western path or the eastern one first. Starting from the west, the 2nd floor begins with a little eye target to shoot, reminiscent of the kind of bow puzzles introduced in the 3D games. Nothing too advanced, but the rooms on the 3rd floor will begin to up the challenge quite a bit. A shooting gallery, wherein the player will have to fire upon several eye targets from a moving platform in order to open a set of doors, leading to a compass and one of the dungeon's small keys. Starting back from the dungeon's main entrance, taking the eastern path will lead to a room with some switches to pull and a new trap to avoid, the Spark, which will circle around the room's edges and let out an electric shock should it get too close. From here, we can ascend to the 3rd floor, where a deactivated Armos blocks us from pulling on another switch, while 2 pressure plates like the ones we encountered back in the Elemental Sanctuary block a door leading to the north. The player will have to locate the nearby tiles needed to split Link in 2 and use these copies to press both plates at the same time, thus opening the way to a Minish portal. With this, we can shrink down to the size of a Bokori and use this form to turn the Armos back on, allowing us to kill it and activate the switch it once protected. This will spawn our 2nd small key, and with both in hand, the player can now head back to the dungeon's entrance and explore the middle pathway for all it's got. At this point, a further 2 pathways will present themselves, one leading to the eastern wing of the dungeon's 2nd floor, and another leading to the west. Starting from the east, there's another eye target to shoot at, though this one in particular is extremely simple and uninteresting. More notably is the mini-boss encounter against another another Dark Nut. It's a good fight because it's exactly the same as the first time we fought him, but the repetition isn't doing any favors for this dungeon. I suppose it's better than fighting a horde of choo-choos though, so it is a marginal improvement on the last dungeon, at the very least. At the end of this pathway lies the dungeon item, the mole mitts, allowing Link to dig through hard-packed dirt like the kind we saw back at the dungeon's entrance. The player can actually backtrack and use these mitts to enter several optional chambers full of treasures like kinstones, rupees, and mysterious seashells. All of this is optional. The only required bit of digging comes at the very end and for the boss fight, and I think that's a great fit for a non-linear dungeon like this. It's cool that the dungeon item is used to search for optional treasures that you have to backtrack for and go out of your way to acquire. Finally, the last pathway, leading into the second floor's eastern wing, presents us with a final gauntlet of puzzle-solving challenges. First, 4 pressure plates will have to be pressed down at once to acquire a third small key, which will necessitate pushing some statues and creating copies of Link with the white sword, and then arranging these elements in such a way that all 4 pressure plates will be pushed down at once. Then, the player will have to shrink down to the size of a Bakori and run through some traps to make his way to a mouse hole, where you can grow back to your proper size and dig through some dirt to acquire the final small key, thus opening the way to the chest containing the big key. And that's really it for the dungeon. It's actually incredibly short. There really isn't all that much of substance here, and the puzzles we do get are pretty disconnected and don't really build on each other in any meaningful way. The only real point of praise I feel like I can give here is towards the non-linear structure, but even that's undercut by just how little there is to explore. 2 branching paths leading down 4 or 5 rooms each really doesn't add much to the replay value here, and at no point does the dungeon get winding or confusing in any meaningful way. In the end, the Fortress of Winds just doesn't have much of anything noteworthy or unique going for it. Well, that is, until we get to the final boss. Okay, the first thing we need to acknowledge is this. Yes, Mazal is just another Bongo Bongo ripoff, I won't deny it. It is cheating to recycle one of the best bosses in the series, and I fully acknowledge that. However, counterpoint, this boss has never been done in 2D before, and the way it's integrated specifically into the Minish Cap style and mechanics is quite masterful. Like its predecessors before it, the fight revolves around Mazal's 2 floating hands, which will slap down upon Link with great force should the player fail to dodge his attacks in time. You'll have to fire upon the palm of each hand whenever possible, then get in close and stab at them while they're stunned. The second hand won't just sit back and do nothing though, so you'll have to manage avoiding the one hand while attacking the other. After defeating both appendages, the head of the automaton will shut down, but no weak point seems to open up. So, what is the player to do here? Well, if you remember the lessons imparted by the area leading up to this dungeon, the robots within these ruins were all built by the Bakori in the distant past, and, as such, it shouldn't be too hard to deduce what you ought to do here. Shrink down in size, enter Masal's head, and destroy it from the inside. This is a super creative boss fight. I absolutely love it. Not only does it efficiently manage to mix the main transformation gimmick of the game into an actual boss battle, but it does so with such grace and fluidity that it feels completely natural. It's hard sometimes to integrate mechanics like this into battles without them feeling gimmicky or out of place, but that's exactly what the Mazal fight manages to achieve. It's a great ending to what has otherwise been a, well, disappointingly simple level design. And yeah, the problems I've listed out cannot simply be erased away by a good boss fight, no matter how creative it might have been. Still, for what it's worth, at least this dungeon managed to end with a bit of a bang. The aftermath of this fight, however, is a bit different from all the other dungeons we've tackled up until this point. Instead of collecting a new element, we find that the people who once lived in these ruins, the Wind Tribe, apparently abandoned the Earth long ago, and now live amongst the clouds. They all took their elements with them, so that means we pretty much did all of this for nothing. Well, not completely nothing. We do receive a device called the Ocarina of Winds, which we can use to call a bird named Zephyr and fast travel to several points on the Overworld map. Fast travel isn't the most useful thing in the Minish Cap since the Overworld is so tiny, but we do need to use this power at least once to travel to Lake Hylia. Why? Well, that's where we have to talk about what is probably the worst quest in this entire game, the library book retrieval. So the basic premise is this. The water element is hidden inside a place called the Temple of Droplets, located in the middle of Lake Hylia, but Link can't reach it yet because he doesn't know how to swim. As such, we will have to find some alternative way to cross the lake, a feat which a Bakori hermit nearby will tell us was accomplished long ago by an adventurer named Librari, and so we are pointed in the direction of his current abode, within Hyrule Town's library, so that we might ask him how he managed to approach the temple all those many years ago. The first problem I want to point out with this quest is the fact that, once again, the triggers for even starting it in the first place are completely asinine and unnecessarily restrictive. The library itself is said to be closed throughout the entire game, that is, until the beginning of this quest. But even more frustratingly, you can't just head to the library and enter it after beating the Fortress of Winds, because an old man will block the entrance for no discernible reason. You have to specifically fast travel to Lake Hylia and talk to the Picori, who then tells you about Librari in order for the old man to disappear from the game world and, as such, finally allow the player to enter the library. The quest you engage in within the library pulls this same bullshit. You'll have to retrieve 3 overdue books in order to restore the path that the Picori carved out of the bookshelves, which leads to Librari's home. But once again, you can't offer your services in this matter to the librarian until after speaking to a very specific Picori who tells us all of this. I know I've said this before, but it feels like none of the quests in this game were designed with replayability or freedom of choice in mind. Why do I have to talk to hyper-specific NPCs in order to trigger completely unrelated changes in the game world? Again, while these sorts of NPC triggers do exist in plenty of the previous entries in this series, it's the execution that's the real problem here. These sorts of NPC triggers aren't nearly as annoying in a game like Link's Awakening, because giving Kiki the monkey some bananas directly influences his decision to build us a bridge. It's a payment for services rendered, and there's simply no other way to cross this moat without employing his help. Or how in Majora's Mask, speaking to Anju with the cafe mask on allows us to meet her in the Stockpot Inn's kitchen at 12:30. This isn't unrelated. She specifically asks us to meet her at that time because she knows we're looking for cafe and can help her in her search. It wouldn't make sense for Anju to just show up to a meeting she hasn't yet planned, so of course I don't mind having to talk to her on every new cycle. There's a diegetic story and gameplay purpose to this quest trigger. By contrast, what about Link speaking to this Picori living near Lake Hylia causes the library in Hyrule Town to open? Why does speaking to the Picori in the library cause the librarian to suddenly ask us to help her track down the overdue books? The answer is nothing. Not a damn thing. None of these tasks are connected to one another in any meaningful way. It's just blatant padding. And it's bad quest planning for the developers to not have designed a more natural roadblock to starting this quest, or to not just allow players to complete certain unrelated tasks out of order. Why do I have to talk to all the right NPCs in a strict, predefined sequence? A Link to the Past just lets you go straight to Sahasrahla, no need to ask about his location from his family. Ocarina of Time allows you to find Rudo's note without speaking to her dad, or to challenge Ingo without talking to Malon, because again, none of these tasks should logically necessitate any previous lines of dialogue. Hell, I'll even give Wind Waker some credit. You didn't need to ask the Great Deku Tree where Makar was before finding him behind the waterfall. Granted, there were plenty of other problems related to that quest, but I can at least give it that much credit. The Minish Cap, by contrast, feels this unhealthy, incessant need to lock all of its content behind hyper-specific story and dialogue requirements. And that simply isn't fun. It's just not fun to be forced to speak to the right NPCs in the right order just to start a quest you already had figured out from the moment it was presented to you. I get that having an actual structure to your game is important, and I'm not even advocating some sort of insane redesign here. I just don't see the purpose of locking so much of this game's content behind arbitrary story beats. The book retrieval quest itself is pretty straightforward. Basically, Librari's home cannot be reached in our Picori form because some books are missing, which has jumbled up the normal pathways the Picori use to navigate around. Yes, this plot point is stupid, I know, because 1, these guys live in a library. Why wouldn't they plan their living spaces around the very obvious reality that people are going to check out books from the shelves? And 2, we should be able to just push a book or two back into place as normal-sized Link, and that would fix everything. You can literally see how easy it would be to make one simple adjustment in order to open up access to Librari's house. But because the game demands it, we just aren't allowed to think outside the box. So on to the retrieval we go. The first overdue book is being borrowed by some cat lady in the southern end of town. Unfortunately, the girl is currently visiting her boyfriend next door, and so she cannot be bothered to fetch the book herself. She gives Link permission to rummage around the place and retrieve it, but the book is too high up on a shelf for him to get it as is. However, the player can deduce through some environmental clues that a path runs from the chimney of the boyfriend's house next door to the cat lady's abode, allowing for someone of a small stature to make their way in and potentially make some changes. So by gathering some water, putting out the fireplace in the boyfriend's house, and then heading up the chimney and back to the cat lady's home, the player can climb atop the bookshelf as a little Picori and push the overdue book onto the ground, thus allowing a normal-sized Link to pick it up and return it to the library. The next overdue overdue book is being rented out by a man called Dr. Left, a reclusive scholar who lives in the town's western district. Unfortunately, the only way to acquire this book will be by moving some bookshelves around while in the Picori form, a feat currently impossible without the power bracelets. This ties back into that legend I mentioned during the side content section of the video. Remember that super awesome tale about secret treasure hidden behind a waterfall? Yeah, turns out it was mainline content, and it's only now that we're allowed to follow through on these hints. The treasure hunt itself becomes exceedingly easy at this junction. Just follow the directions leading to a little fountain, where the pipes lead into a small cave containing the power bracelets. With this new power in hand, the player can return to Dr. Left's house, move a couple shelves around, and push the overdue book out from the attic and bring it back to the library. The final book is being checked out by the town mayor, Hagen, who tells us that he left it in his cabin near Lake Hylia. All this really requires is some traveling to the lake and clearing a little leaf raft section utilizing the gust jar. It's nothing special, just sort of time consuming. And that's pretty much it for the whole quest. We just return the books to the library and watch as they get put back in their rightful place, thus allowing the player to finally meet with Librari, who opens up a trapdoor which leads us to his old flippers, with which we can now swim in deep bodies of water. The path to the Temple of Droplets isn't fraught with many dangers, so all you really need to do is head back to Lake Hylia and swim on over to the dungeon's entrance. To be perfectly honest, this quest is not only unnecessary from a story and character perspective, but also entirely uninteresting from the standpoint of gameplay or level design. So, in other words, why even put a quest like this into the game in the first place? Well, to pad out the runtime seems like a simple answer. This game is incredibly low on its dungeon content, after all, only amounting to 6 levels in total, and the overworld is the smallest of any game in the series, as far as I can tell. In fact, whereas all the other 2D handheld Zelda games would run me 12 to 15 hours when 100% in the game, the Minish Cap, despite being far less limited in terms of hardware and data management, only took me about 8 to 10 hours to beat, and that's including the 2 hours spent literally just pulling for figurines. Exclude that, and the game really only runs at about 6, maybe 7 hours at best. So the Minish Cap kinda needs in-between quests like this one to stretch out its runtime, and in concept, that's totally fine. Link's Awakening and Majora's Mask both had minor quests sprinkled between their dungeons, and I love those games. The difference between those titles and the Minish Cap, though, is that their quests had interesting stories, characters, and gameplay sections attached to them that would also tie into the design of their dungeon quite brilliantly. The book retrieval quest, by contrast, doesn't do any of that. Librari is a non-character. The cat lady and her boyfriend are non-characters. Dr. Left is a non-character. Hagen is a non-character. Hell, even the librarian herself is a completely empty shell of a character. There's no story here to witness either, and we aren't being taught any key mechanics that'll apply to the next dungeon. Outside of swimming, I guess, but that's pretty self-explanatory. Sure, the flippers we receive at the very end will be important, but that's just the thing. We receive them at the very end of the quest. I just wish I had more to say about this section, but between the linear progression and uninteresting puzzles and narrative to experience, I can't really call this quest anything other than an abject failure. I wish I could follow up such a negative section with a positive one. That sort of pattern tends to balance these videos out much better than if I were just to yell at a game for 5 hours on end, like I did in the Wind Waker review. But unfortunately, our next dungeon, the Temple of Droplets, is definitely the worst level design from this entire game, though you would not think it at first glance. After all, it does host one of the most interesting atmospheres of any dungeon in this game, taking place in a frozen, ancient temple lying at the bottom of a lake. As such, icy floors that mess with Link's traction and thermodynamic puzzles are practically a given. But perhaps most impressive of all is the soundtrack. Temple of Droplets is legit one of the best pieces of dungeon music from the entire Legend of Zelda series, right up there with the tracks composed by Koji Kondo. It's a shame the only samples we have are ripped from the god-awful Game Boy Advance sound chip, but even with that terrible disadvantage, it's difficult to deny just how incredible this piece is, and how well it fits with the tone of this dungeon. Welp, that's everything good I had to say about the Temple of Droplets, at least till we get to the final boss. Now let's actually move on to the level design itself and see where things fall apart from here. The dungeon begins, interestingly enough, by presenting the boss room door right at the start, blocking the way going south. This will force the player to head into the dungeon's northern wing, where we'll encounter a few key mechanics. First is a lever that'll open up a trapdoor leading outside, allowing for sunlight to shine into the lower parts of the dungeon. Second is a block pushing puzzle taking place on ice, which works exactly exactly the way it did in past games. A single push will cause the icy block to slide until it is stopped by some external force, necessitating careful planning ahead before any action is taken. In this instance, a small key will be frozen within a block of ice, and the player will have to guide said block to the now exposed sunlight in order to melt it and retrieve the key inside. The next room builds on this mechanic by introducing a slightly more complex version of this puzzle. The boss key is frozen in another block of ice, but the path leading towards the sunlight isn't particularly straightforward. The player will have to set up a pathway using other blocks of ice and carefully plan ahead to get the boss key to its end destination, after which we can head back to the dungeon start and make our way south. It's a good introduction to the dungeon's ice physics, even if the puzzles themselves are rather simple. Upon entering the boss room, we'll find the water element frozen in a block of ice at the room's center, with no current way to get to it. The only path forward is towards the dungeon's western wing, in which a large river flows with spiky roller traps blocking the way. The player will have to swim down the watery path and dive beneath the traps, but honestly, that's really all there is to it. It's nothing special or advanced. There's also a riddle to solve here, which is honestly so stupid that I can't help but point it out. A stone slab will read as such: the way forward is hidden in the bottom of the pot. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, heading east, we swim down the river for just a bit longer before encountering a collection of rocky walls shaped exactly like a pot, which you can swim to the bottom of to retrieve a small key. Like, come on, guys, was this really the best idea for a riddle that you could come up with? I get that not everyone playing this game is necessarily going to be a Zelda veteran, but this is the 4th dungeon, and you're hitting us with word problems so simple that all they require is decent human eyes with which to make out basic shapes? Come on, man. The rest of the way from here is a simple boating section, again utilizing the gust jar to propel a lily pad through the water and make our way further down the river. Notably, the player will eventually have to disembark and solve another block pushing puzzle in order to progress, but this one's honestly a little easier than the last one we did, so it doesn't really build on the previous challenges in any meaningful way. Eventually, this path will wrap back around to the boss room, but from a higher vantage point, from which we can push a lever and open a trap door in the ceiling, shining light into the room in the process. This will melt some of the ice which previously blocked the path leading to the dungeon's eastern wing, allowing us to finally navigate it. From here, the icy floors will create an interesting traversal challenge, in which the player will have to maneuver around tight walkways made of ice and avoid falling off the edge. It's a bit of a generic repeat of level designs from past Zelda games' ice dungeons, but it works just as well here as it ever did in those games. At the very end of this path lies the dungeon's mini-boss, the Blue Choo-Choo. This is literally just a repeat of the Green Choo-Choo boss fight from the first dungeon. I mean, don't get me wrong, that was a good fight, but the real question here is, why are we repeating it again? And why in this dungeon of all places? And actually, I want to take this moment to express one of my biggest problems with the Temple of Droplets in general. The enemy variety in this dungeon sucks. It is literally all the exact same bug enemies that we have been fighting throughout this entire game. Mulldozers, pestos, beetles, slagulas, matterpillars, and that's fucking it. Not only is this repetitive, which should be bad enough in and of itself, but it completely kills the mood and theming of this dungeon. I get that we're in our Picori form, so the enemies we fight have to be small, and that's fine, but this is the ice dungeon. You know, that wintry element which is well known for killing bugs and slowing down their population growth. Cold environments are associated with less bug life, not more, so why is this dungeon full of them? Why aren't there unique ice enemies in this level instead? And also, on the topic of atmosphere, what the fuck is this place even supposed to be? The Deepwood Shrine was a Minish temple built as a meeting grounds for Picori and Hylian alike. The Cave of Flames was an ancient human-run mine that likely had associations with the Picori, perhaps even providing the original ore used to forge the Picori blade. And the Fortress of Winds was a military complex built to protect the people of the Wind Tribe, with old Picori-built automatons still having a run of the place. In every previous dungeon, the enemies, atmosphere, and structure would all fit with the theming, storytelling, and lore which surrounded the level design. It's honestly my favorite thing about this game, and an aspect it gets uniquely right, even in comparison to many mainline Zelda games. So then tell me, who built the Temple of Droplets, what was its purpose, and most importantly of all, why are there no enemies in this entire dungeon that fit with its theming? Why is every single enemy present in this level a recycled mob from a previous dungeon set in an entirely opposite biome? Well, the answer to that question, I believe, is probably the same answer as to why this dungeon's level design feels so insubstantial. This dungeon was the neglected one amongst its brethren, and likely the last priority on the list of level designs the devs had to finish before getting the final final product out the door. Because now that we've killed the mini-boss and gotten our dungeon item, the flame lantern, this whole level's pretty much done. That's it. You just use the lantern to melt the ice blocking the way further into the dungeon's eastern wing, solve a couple easy as hell torch puzzles and one final block pushing challenge, and then make your way to the second and final switch that'll shine even more sunlight into the boss room, melting the ice in the chamber and causing a once frozen Octorok to suck up the water element. We'll get to that fight in just a minute, but I need to express just how short and insubstantial this dungeon is, particularly for its late placement in this game. This is the 4th dungeon. 4th out of a total of 6. And it's not only recycling literally the exact same enemies from the first dungeon, but it's simultaneously failing to present a more complicated level layout to boot. I like linear Zelda dungeons enough when they're done right, but goddamn does the Minish Cap just hate even flirting with the idea of giving its player base some level of agency, of trying to confuse them and provide challenges that require some real thought. In that sense, I'd say that the Temple of Droplets encapsulates everything wrong with the Minish Cap as a whole. It's short, rigid, repetitive, and ultimately feels like it doesn't fully trust its own players. But if there's any one thing this dungeon does get right, with the exception of its music of course, it would have to be the boss fight against a rather special enemy. The greatest and bestest creature in all of Zelda, the Big Octorok. Okay, I just have to point out the obvious. Yes, my channel icon comes from the Octoroks designed by Capcom for the Game Boy Advance games, and as such, I absolutely love this guy. But personal biases aside, the Big Octorok provides an absolutely excellent challenge. The creature begins the battle by chucking giant rocks at the player, the way a smaller Octorok might, which you'll have to bounce back at him either with the sword or the shield. Once he's taken enough damage, the Octorok will freeze the shallow water lining the room and change the terrain to an icy floor, messing with the player's traction as a result. This is especially troublesome because your objective now will be to set the Octo's tail on fire, causing the creature to run into the walls in pain and bring an avalanche of boulders down in the process. You'll have to repeat the pattern from here, but the Octo will employ new tactics with each bit of damage he takes. First gaining the ability to suck up Link and spit him out for an entire heart's worth of damage, then deploying a smoke screen that'll black out the room and force the player to use the lantern to see around with. All of these various strategies and obstacles utilized by the Big Octo make him an absolute beast of a boss fight, and definitely one of the most complex fights in this entire game. An absolutely fantastic way to end a dungeon that has, unfortunately, otherwise been a pretty massive dud up until this point. I really wish I could have had better things to say about this dungeon. Honestly, I do. It was actually the only level design I really remembered from this game after so many years of having not played it. It was the one I was looking forward to the most when I first started this review, and in the ways that I remembered it, it did not disappoint. Temple of Droplets is still a great song, and the visual design of the dungeon and its environmental elements is awesome, but unfortunately, it's in the parts that really matter, the level design, enemy variety, and pacing, that this dungeon falls completely flat. An unfortunate end to a dungeon that otherwise had a lot of potential. Upon exiting the Temple of Droplets, the player will of course be directed to the Elemental Sanctuary once again in order to upgrade the White Sword. But before we can do any of that, a visitor from beyond the grave appears. The ghost of an ancient king of Hyrule named Gustav will speak to us, telling Link that he must visit his grave should he wish to find the way to the Wind Tribe. What prompts this sudden visit? Fuck if I know. I hate to sound like a stick in the mud, but it needs to be said that having the ghost of a long-dead character convey information and provide divine assistance at a point in the plot that would otherwise be a dead end because the writer couldn't find a more dynamic way to advance the plot is almost always a product of lazy or otherwise bad writing. King Gustav isn't a product of long-held regrets tying a spirit to the mortal plane, nor is he a mischievous force who can help as much as hinder our journey. He is, instead, simply a benevolent force of good who wishes to help save his kingdom from beyond the grave, and has no limits on his time spent in this world despite maintaining all of his mental faculties. There's two main problems I have with this plot point. First, it kind of minimizes the impact of death in your story if people can just continue to communicate and act from beyond the grave, and that's always a recipe for disaster. And two, divine help should always come with a caveat or some sort of earned deed. The fairies in the Zelda series tend to exemplify that idea well, and the Minish Cap even gets that part right, as lying to them or acting selfishly will cause the deities to hurt you, whereas speaking the truth and showing selfless virtues will bring about their help. By contrast, King Gustav's divine assistance doesn't come with any caveats or prerequisites. He exists purely to advance the plot along and provide assistance to our hero. It doesn't ruin the following quest by any means, but it is lazy writing. Luckily, from a gameplay perspective, this quest is actually quite interesting. We travel to an area in Hyrule's north called the Royal Valley, a spooky, dark forest that hosts the royal family family's personal graveyard. This area actually has one of the best atmospheres of any graveyard from the series. The use of dark lighting, purples, browns, and blacks for the colors, and the fantastic OST in the background all combine to create one of the creepiest areas I've ever explored in a 2D Zelda title. It's such a shame then that there isn't actually much to do here. You just have to walk through a forest, get the key to the graveyard from Dompy the Gravedigger, and then bam, that's it. I wish there was more content here because this is definitely one of the most interesting looking areas in the whole game. More interesting, however, is the little mini dungeon lying at the end of the valley, because the king, as befits a monarch, is buried in a complex crypt beneath the graveyard, and we'll have to fight several enemies and solve a few puzzles to reach him. I call this a mini dungeon more out of grace than anything because honestly, it's so short that even defining it as such is kinda pushing things. There isn't a dungeon map or compass in here, and the level design itself is entirely straightforward. Still, that doesn't take away from the many positives on display here. The crypt opens up by introducing a new enemy type, the Gibdo, who is definitely one of the toughest opponents in this whole game, doing massive damage with his grapple attacks and taking several hits to down. You can burn away his bandages using the flame lantern, but this is risky since it requires you to get close to him. And even so, you'll have to fight a Stalfos right afterwards, so it's not like this is an instant kill or anything like that. The next challenge is a two-pronged one. A couple locked doors will block the way into the king's tomb, and the player will have to solve twin puzzles on the east and western ends of the room in order to find both keys. These puzzles combine moving platforms and spark traps to create deadly obstacles, which the player will have to dodge while dragging several copies of Link over to the other side of the room to activate several plates all at once, thus summoning the small keys we need to progress forward. It's actually a really nice way to integrate the new upgrade to the Bikori blade into some puzzle solving, and what's really fantastic about this is how the very next dungeon, as well as the last two boss fights in this game, will seek to build on this exact kind of puzzle solving by presenting similar challenges of their own. In other words, this mini dungeon, for as short as it might be, serves a pretty important purpose. It builds on a mechanic that'll see increasing use in the following mainline dungeon, thus creating a gameplay continuity that carries over into future level designs. This is exactly what a pre-dungeon quest should seek to achieve, and it's the kind of smart design that was missing from the last several in-between sections of the game. It's definitely a nice change of pace. Upon reaching the end of the crypt, King Gustav's ghost will give us a kinstone piece and tell us to seek out the source of Hyrule's flow. Assuming you weren't born yesterday, then you'll probably figure out almost immediately that he's referring to the source of Hyrule's one and only river, Vale Falls. This is maybe one of the smallest areas on the overworld map, requiring only a short climb up a few rock faces and a couple caves that you'll have to walk through. And I say walk because there aren't any puzzles or traversal challenges to overcome here. This area is dry as a bone as far as content goes. You can really tell the devs were racing to the finish line by this point in development. It's kinda disappointing. But upon reaching the mountain's peak, a brand new and rather exciting biome will await us. Link will jump into a vortex that takes both him and Eslo up to the skies, where the clouds are packed like snow and can be walked upon by those who are pure of heart. At least, that's what we're told by a red-haired lady who's already up here. Apparently, she and her sister are both members of the Wind Tribe and are trying to get back home after attending the Bikori Festival. However, the way forward is currently blocked, and we'll have to acquire 5 kinstones spread amongst the clouds in order to fix that. This section is kind of unnecessary. I mean, it is super cool in concept, don't get me wrong. Gliding between beds of clouds like they're islands upon a sea is quite an interesting concept, and a completely unique perspective for the Zelda series. Up until this point, anyway. Most Zelda games after this will also add a sky section pretty much every time without fail. But gameplay-wise, this kinda doesn't connect to anything. It makes no sense why kinstones are even in the cloud beds in the first place, and especially why they act as keys to entering the Wind Tribe's palace. And the quest itself only really involves traveling a short distance and fighting the occasional enemy in order to pick up kinstones and bring them back to their rightful place. It doesn't build on any major puzzle solving or gameplay mechanics, so it's kinda just padding at this point. Regardless, after retrieving all 5 kinstones, the way to the Wind Tribe's manor will finally open, and it's at this point that we need to talk about just how utterly stupid the Wind Tribe as a concept really is. Okay, so the people of the Wind Tribe live their lives atop the clouds. Somehow. We'll assume that the same magic they used to even stay up here in the first place also allows them to bypass the whole lack of oxygen problems they would immediately run into. Even so, where do they get their food from? Or their clothes? Or the stone, wood, and other natural resources they would need to build and maintain the large manor they live in? I'll just stop myself right there and tell you the answer to all these questions and any more that you might have. There is no answer. Fujibayashi clearly didn't think that far ahead. The Wind Tribe exists purely in concept, with no attempt being made to explain what their society is like, how it functions, or why they even made this place their home in the first place. The closest thing we get to any sort of detail on these peoples comes from their elder, who tells us that the palace Palace of Winds isn't normally open to outsiders, but he'll make an exception just for us. Who the palace was built for and what other sort of outsiders this tribe even receives, given their location, is never revealed. And this, unfortunately, is the entire extent of the background lore we'll ever receive about these people. And that's pretty embarrassing, considering that somehow the Wind Ruins, you know, that lifeless, empty husk of an ancient civilization, provided more information about the Wind Tribe's past than its living members can tell us about its present. It's just disappointing to think about how interesting this tribe could have been, only for Fujibayashi to completely drop the ball and forget to give these people any semblance of detail. How tragic. Lack of proper writing aside, with the Elder's permission, the player will finally be able to enter this game's penultimate dungeon, the Palace of Winds. This is maybe the most interesting dungeon in the whole game, because it not only takes place in one of the most unique settings I've ever seen from a 2D Zelda title, but also because it breaks nearly every rule of Zelda dungeon design while still, somehow, managing to make things work in its own unique way. It begins on a platform looking down upon the clouds and sky below us. The atmosphere is unmatched here. The music has this triumphant, rising sound to it that fits perfectly with our ascent up this winding, towering complex. It truly feels like the zenith of this world, as if we're finally closing in on the end of our long journey. The level design is particularly interesting though. The dungeon is split into two acts, with the second half featuring more standard indoor puzzle solving, while the first one is an upwards ascent through linear challenges taking place outside the dungeon. On the first floor, P-hats will glide across bottomless pits as the player is forced to navigate thin walkways and revolving bridges. It's easy to get knocked off of here and lose some health if you aren't careful. After this comes a section involving a moving platform, where you'll have to avoid obstacles while maintaining your footing to make it to the other side, then followed by some more thin bridge sections to round things out. The number of pure traversal challenges here might seem random at first, but it is upon reaching the end of this first floor that we begin to see the larger purpose of these sections. For this dungeon breaks a rather long-standing taboo of the Zelda series. It gives us our dungeon item right at the start, and this item is an old familiar friend from the previous Game Boy entries of the Zelda series. The Rock's Cape, an item that'll allow Link to jump and even glide over traps, deadly ledges, and all sorts of other ground-based dangers. Normally, Zelda dungeons don't tend to give the player their main item at the very start because they generally intend for that item to reframe the level design in a brand new light, to force players to look upon previous rooms and hallways through a different lens, and solve puzzles previously thought impossible with their brand new abilities. But the Palace of Winds breaks that taboo by giving us the Rock's Cape right at the start. So why is that? Well, because the Palace of Winds is a completely linear level design. It doesn't even attempt to flirt with any kind of backtracking or non-linearity of any kind, and most of its challenges revolve around platforming. This mechanic simply doesn't exist without the Rock's Cape. As such, giving us this dungeon item right here at the beginning is an excellent way of allowing the rest of the level design to take full advantage of our new abilities. It's a brilliant little trick, and one which has only really been pulled off before in Ocarina of Time Shadow Temple, which, if you'll recall, I labeled as being one of the greatest examples of linear dungeon design done right in a Zelda game. So, needless to say, the Palace of Winds repeating this same trick is a bit of inspiration which I am much in favor of, and one that I believe benefits this dungeon immensely. The dungeon teaches us this new jumping mechanic in the very same area we acquire the cape in. The path we took to get here will close off behind us, but by jumping over a gap to the east, we can work our way back around to an earlier part of the level and make our way up to the second floor. From here, more platforming challenges will present themselves, first with a couple gaps to jump over, then with wind turbines that can blow you off the dungeon's edge should you get caught in them. Further down the line is a moving platform beneath some metal grates, which will open up like trapdoors and dump you out the moment you jump on top of them. The challenge then is to jump between the grates and the moving platform below them at just the right time, lest you miss the opportunity and fall into the endless abyss below. It's also at this point that the dungeon introduces some puzzles utilizing the Picori Blade's copying ability. First, the player will have to create 3 copies of Link to push a giant block out of the way. Simple enough. Then use them to hit 4 separate switches all at once. Again, nothing too fancy. But starting on the 3rd floor, we run into a puzzle that combines both of these concepts at once. A moving platform will bring us over to another end of the dungeon, but the path it leads down is full of treacherous obstacles that can easily knock Link into the endless abyss below, and the way forward from there is blocked by a giant rock. The only way to move it then will be to split Link into 3 copies once again, but the only area where you're able to do so lies at the very beginning of this path. The solution then is to split Link in 3, guide him carefully onto the platform while avoiding all the many obstacles on your way, and then use the copies to open the path forward. These are good enough challenges on their own, but it's the greater challenge that they're building up to that's really impressive about this section, because the boss fight is going to utilize both the platforming platforming and Link's copying ability to tremendous effect, as we'll see soon enough. The 4th floor, meanwhile, seeks to build on the wind turbines introduced earlier in the dungeon. First with the platforming section, in which you'll have to jump across a gap while avoiding being pushed off by gusts of wind, but then with a challenge in which you'll have to harness the momentum of the wind to propel Link across an impossibly large gap. And on the 5th floor, this new concept will be utilized quite a bit, as the player will have to navigate around large swaths of empty space using nothing but the wind and well-placed jumps to guide him. It's a great way to mix the wind physics, a pretty old mechanic for this game, going all the way back to Deepwood Shrine, with our newest dungeon item. At the very top of the 5th floor, after entering what is at first presented as the boss room, we will be tasked with doing something quite drastic. To drop down all the way back to the 1st floor again, only this time, we end up in a small boss arena, where another Dark Knight fight commences. I need to criticize the dungeon at this point for once again recycling a previous mini-boss, especially one that's been twice repeated at this point in the game, because this fight is easy as shit, especially given the fact that you can just push him off the edge and instantly end the fight that way. I don't know why the devs couldn't have taken the time to add in just a couple more unique fights, because the enemy variety in this game is generally good. It's really only in the Temple of Droplets and these repeat mini-boss battles that they drop the ball on this particular aspect, unfortunately. Still, where the Palace of Winds goes from here is quite interesting, because now begins its second act. We start on the 1st floor of the dungeon's interior, pitch black and full of deadly Gibdos. The player will have to pull out the flame lantern and use its light to navigate around the room, finding within it the compass and a flight of stairs leading up to the 2nd floor. Here, another Picori Blade puzzle requires that the player create 3 copies of Link and bring them to the other side of a room, where they'll have to strike 4 switches all at once. Some normal obstacles, like pillars and enemies, both make an appearance here, but the real twist comes in the form of some cracked floors, which will collapse should you stand on them for too long, creating impassable obstacles in the process. The 3rd floor, meanwhile, will force you to think about the dungeon in a more macro sense, as there will be several holes that you'll need to jump down to access parts of the lower floors you couldn't before. This will lead both to several small keys as well as some optional treasures, like rupees and a couple kinstone pieces. The 4th floor, meanwhile, combines all of these previous elements into a few key challenges, platforming sections, bomb puzzles, and a few deadly combat challenges against this game's toughest foes, including Gibdos, Moblins, and the Red Stalfos. And that's pretty much it for the whole dungeon. There's no real curveballs here, just a straightforward romp with plenty of platforming, combat, and puzzle-solving challenges to overcome. It's far from insubstantial, but honestly, if it weren't for the visuals, music, and general atmosphere of this dungeon, then I think it would have felt much more basic than it actually does. And even as is, there really isn't anything that exceptional about it. However, we're not quite done yet, for it is this dungeon's final challenge, the battle against its final boss, that truly ties a bow on the overall experience. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce you to one of the greatest boss fights in all of Zelda, the Jorg pair. Despite what the name might suggest, these creatures in no way resemble their namesakes from either of the previous games. For the Jorg, in this instance, is no simple shark or overgrown fish god, but rather a pair of ginormous, flying stingray-like creatures who will not only serve as our enemy, but also the very environment in which the fight takes place. The player will have to battle the larger Jorg from atop her back, and then jump onto her smaller mate at certain intervals, creating a unique battle that utilizes the dungeon's sky theming to its full advantage. As for the fight itself, it's fantastic. Jorg will open up 3 of her many eyes in a randomized pattern, and the player will have to respond by splitting Link into 3 copies and striking them all at the same time. As you've probably noticed, this is eerily reminiscent of the kind of puzzles we've been solving throughout the dungeon's runtime. That in and of itself is a pretty smart move, but more interestingly is the way this mechanic combines with the other central mechanic of this dungeon, the platforming. Because after striking the big Jorg's eyes, the smaller one will swoop down at you, and you'll have to jump onto its back and fight it while the bigger Jorg recovers. This whole fight requires heavy vigilance, as the player will switch between precisely matching Link's copies with the arrangement of Jorg's eyes, and then quickly platforming onto a moving target. As the battle goes on, the smaller Jorg will shoot out energy blasts, while their offspring will fly across the screen and take a swipe at the player, creating an almost bullet hell-like section that'll have you on the edge of your seat. Legit, it's one of the most intense boss fights in the entire Zelda series, and the fact that it takes place in the sky, on the backs of the very beasts we seek to slay, makes the atmosphere feel completely unmatched compared to anything else from the series up until this point. It's easily one of the top 10 boss fights from the entire Legend of Zelda series, and what an excellent way to cap off this dungeon. You know, it may not have been the most mechanically complex or intricately designed level in this game, much less in the series as a whole, but the Palace of Winds still manages to stand out as one of the most unique dungeons in all of Zelda, and one that succeeds in connecting its puzzle solving to its final boss fight. And for that, I have to give this dungeon major props. And with that, point, we have now gathered our fourth and final element. All that's left now is to head back to the Elemental Sanctuary and restore the Picori blade to its former glory, transforming it into the Four Sword, a blade capable of splitting its wielder into 4 copies and breaking the curses caused by Vaati's terrible magic. But it is at this junction that we also learn a very important secret: the location of the Light Force. According to the murals inside the Elemental Sanctuary, the Light Force, the limitless source of power used to seal away Hyrule's monsters in the first place, resides in the maidens of the Hyrule royal family's line. In other words, within Zelda. Vaati was apparently listening to us as we read this, and so he discovers this information for himself at the same time that we do. He then blasts Link with an orb of magic and just leaves him, despite completely knocking him out in one hit. Why didn't he just kill us here? He has the opportunity, since Link is completely vulnerable, and he doesn't have a reason to leave us alive either. We'll just jot that down as a plot hole. Anyway, as we come to, the castle will have completely changed, with the structure turning into a perverted dark version of its previous splendor. This acts as our final dungeon. Kind of a quick transition, I know. You can really feel the devs' beards dragging across the keyboard at this point in the game, as if they felt like they had to get the shit out as quickly as possible. Considering that the Nintendo DS released only 2 weeks after this game's publication, I'm assuming that this was probably actually the case. The devs knew they didn't want to compete with an entirely brand new piece of hardware and its game lineup, so taking an extra week to flesh out the transition between dungeons just wasn't going to work out, unfortunately. Still, for what it's worth, Dark Hyrule Castle is a pretty decent final dungeon. Of course, the atmosphere, combined with the haunting remix of Majestic Castle, really gives this level's theming a big kick in the ass. A consistent quirk of Vaati's magic throughout the whole story is that it can never really create anything new, only pervert that which already exists. Be it Eslo turning into a hat, Princess Zelda being petrified into stone, or even the hideous forms he transforms himself into as the game goes on, Vaati's sorcery never brings with it any true originality or brand new creations of its own. Dark Hyrule Castle reflects that aspect of his magic, turning servants and soldiers into mere statues while replacing them with monsters, stretching once opulent hallways while filling them with deadly traps, and suspending the entire structure in an almost formless void, instead of the lush green valleys it originally lorded over. It's a nice way to communicate our villain's self-centered desire for power and why it's so destructive. It's far from being anywhere near as complex or interesting as Ganon's motivations were back in Ocarina of Time, but by Minish Cap standards, it's actually pretty good. As for the level itself, we begin in the basement floor of the castle, and immediately are presented with a completely shifted landscape. The previously short hallways have now been stretched, and rooms have been shifted around. It's clear that we cannot exit the way we entered, so the player will have no choice but to head to the dungeon's east, where enemies and fire traps block the way to the castle's prison. It's in here that we find the petrified body of King Daltis, trapped within one of the many cells, who the player can turn back to normal by striking him with the Four Sword. The king then explains to Link what the player already knew. The Vaati took over the castle, disguised himself as its master, and now seeks to suck the light force out from Princess Zelda, which will probably kill her in the process. So he gives us the key that will allow us to exit the basement, and asks that we save his daughter at all costs. At this point, it should be noted that the player can actually leave the castle behind and gather any last bits of optional content he missed, except for 2 specific rewards, the final piece of heart and the mirror shield respectively, which you can't acquire until after beating the game for some reason. It's actually really stupid thinking about it, because there's literally nothing else to do after beating Vaati. The game's over, and there aren't any optional dungeons or bosses to beat either. Again, this feels like a massive oversight born more out of time constraints rather than a deliberate design choice on the developer's part. As for the rest of the dungeon, it's a fairly linear experience. No surprise there, given the general trend of this game's level designs, but it tries to make up for that by crafting more complex puzzles and enemy encounters than any of the previous dungeons. Starting from the first floor, the player will be presented with a series of challenges to overcome in order to ascend the castle. First is a series of large mounted guns shooting cannonballs, which Eslo will inform us can be deflected back by using the sword. However, there are 4 of these cannons, and they all have to be destroyed at the same time. The solution then should be rather simple. Split Link into 4 and use each copy to deflect the projectiles all at once. Simple concept, but it feeds into the next puzzle quite well. 4 switches lie at the southern end of a room, with many large stones guarded by a moving spark trap blocking the way. The player will not only have to split Link into 4 copies and bring them to the other side, but avoid being hit by the spark or moving a copy through a stone, as either mistake will result in the copies dissipating. Passing these trials earns the player another small key, allowing us to open a locked door leading down to the basement once again. Here, the Picori blade puzzles we just engaged in will be built upon further. As another 4 cannons, the this time arranged in a staggered vertical fashion and firing from both sides, will present a much more difficult scenario. You'll have to carefully arrange Link's copies in such a way that a well-timed spin attack will deflect all 4 cannonballs at once, which is a fairly difficult maneuver to pull off. It's at this point, after ascending some stairs leading back up to the dungeon's first floor, that we're presented with this dungeon's mini-boss, the Dark Nut. You know, I've defended this enemy's repeated use in past dungeons because it's actually kind of a decent fight, at least compared to its Wind Waker counterpart, but this is just excessive. Dungeons 3, 5, and 6 all reuse the exact same mini-boss. Half the mini-bosses in this game are just the same guy wearing a slightly different colored suit of armor. I would say this repetition reminds me of the Dark Nut fights from the Wind Waker, but it's actually a lot more akin to the Wizrobe from Majora's Mask, since that was also a decent mini-boss who got ruined through being reused in half the dungeons in that title. I guess it's an inevitability or something with these smaller Zelda games. It's really unfortunate that the devs couldn't have been more selective with this repetition, or added at least one more mini-boss to this freaking game. Jesus Christ. Regardless, after beating the Dark Nut, the player can continue on to the second floor, where one final gliding section will await us. The player will have to circle around the castle's exterior and avoid cannonballs all the while, lest Link be struck midair and fall into the abyss below. It's a nice way to show the impact of Vaati's perverse magic upon the world, and how destructive his getting the Light Force will be for all of Hyrule. Mechanically simple, but thematically important. The final stretch of the dungeon is a scavenger hunt for 4 final small keys, spread across 4 separate rooms on the dungeon's second floor. There are all sorts of assorted puzzles and traversal challenges to navigate here, the principal of which is 5 separate Dark Nut fights. No, I'm not fucking kidding. It's excessive, I know. But there's also some other stuff. Fire traps to avoid, some arrow targets, an interesting bomb puzzle combined with a moving platform, basically a medley of all the many different mechanics we've seen throughout this entire level. And that's the end of the dungeon. Seriously, that's it. It's actually shorter than any other level in this game besides maybe the Fortress of Winds. All in all, it's kind of average at best, but as far as final dungeons in Zelda go specifically, this is definitely the worst one from the entire series up until this point. It doesn't feel like much of a culmination of the entire game's mechanics, the way other final Zelda dungeons tend to be. Sure, it makes good use of Link's copying ability, but most of your dungeon items are sort of just relegated to the sidelines, while the build up to the final confrontation against Vaati kinda just feels meaningless. Again, I get that conceptually we're supposed to feel concerned for Zelda, but it's kinda hard to care that much about a character we haven't heard speak since the first 5 minutes of the game, and there isn't any sort of interpersonal conflict of Vaati and Link showdown either. Hell, even the Wind Waker, for as stupid as it could be, did a better job at establishing an antagonistic relationship between Link and Ganon than this game ever does. It's far from a bad final dungeon, but compared to what it could have been, and what the previous mainline games in this series have managed to accomplish, the Minish Cap's dark Hyrule castle just sort of feels underwhelming. Well, the dungeon itself aside, the final boss fight against Vaati is actually quite the winner here. We interrupt Vaati's ceremony just as he's about to drain the Light Force from Princess Zelda, so the Sorcerer decides to take us on once and for all. It's at this point that he transforms into his first phase, Vaati Reborn, a tall, lording figure who will surround himself with 4 separate eyes that'll swoop around the main body and shoot out lasers. These eyes resemble the same defense mechanism of the Patra from the first Legend of Zelda, and can be dealt with in the same way. Just keep your distance and strike at them with the sword, at which point Vaati's central eye will be exposed and can be struck. Rinse and repeat. The one curveball is that the eyes will eventually develop a sort of smoke screen around them, protecting them from any and all harm, but a quick blow from the Gust Jar will solve that problem lickety-split. After dealing enough damage, Vaati will enter his second phase, Vaati Transfigured, a hideous amalgamation of eyes that'll lay purple spikes across the room and smash the ground to cause pieces of the ceiling to crash down upon Link. His protective eyes have grown both in size and number at this point, completely surrounding the main body and becoming invulnerable to sword strikes in the process. The only way to damage him then will be by using the bow to pierce each eye, revealing which of the 4 are his weak points, and then splitting Link into 4 copies to strike them all at once, at which point the main body shall become vulnerable. And that's the whole phase. It doesn't really switch up at all, but Vaati does increase the speed and intensity of his attacks as the fight goes on, so there is some incremental difficulty on display here at the very least. After defeating Vaati's second form, the Sorcerer will explode and be seemingly defeated for good. The curse put on Princess Zelda will break, and she she thanks Link for coming to rescue her. The castle begins to collapse, Ocarina of Time style, and the player will have to run over to the elemental sanctuary in order to escape. But just before we can exit the castle, Vaati grabs Link and pulls him into a little pocket dimension, challenging him to one final duel before the end. This third phase of the fight, Vaati's Wrath, is by far the most complex. The main body is protected, once again, by 4 invulnerable eyes, and he also grows 2 large arms on top of that, which the monster will transport through a portal and have pop up right from under Link's feet. But by using the Kanepachi, the player will be able to upend the arm and sever its connection to the main body. At this point, you'll then have to shrink down to Picori size and enter the arm to destroy it from the inside, where a singular real eye will float amongst a sea of fakes. It's kind of a complex process and takes a lot of thinking to figure out the first time around. Honestly, even using the Kanepachi in this way is kinda strange, but I do like to see old dungeon items being used in final fights like this. It's a nice blend of both puzzle solving and combat, giving this battle layers of complexity befitting a final boss fight. After destroying both arms, the protective eyes will begin their attack, charging up energy blasts before firing them at the player. You'll have to split Link into 4 and deflect the projectiles back at each eye all at once, much like the cannonballs we encountered earlier in the dungeon. The process is complicated, however, by the sparks of electricity Vaati will let out between each volley, because if they touch even a single copy, then they'll electrocute the player and deal quite a bit of damage. And since these sparks are shot out horizontally, in the same pattern you'll have to assemble the copies in, dodging the projectiles while maneuvering around 4 different versions of Link becomes quite difficult. It's an intense fight, building on the many mechanics we've gotten used to both throughout the entire game and in this final dungeon specifically. Taken as a whole, all 3 phases of this fight build on one another quite brilliantly, using the sword, Gust Jar, Kanepachi, bow and arrows, and our 2 main mechanics, shrinking and copying Link in tandem with one another, all combining into a 3-stage final combat gauntlet that couldn't have capped off this game any better. It's a top-tier final boss fight from a gameplay standpoint, and an absolutely excellent way to send this game off. After felling the evil Sorcerer once and for all, Link will return to the courtyard we left Princess Zelda in, where she'll express gratitude for Link's safety, but lament over the loss of her home and so many people, at least in concept. I didn't see a single person die this entire game, so I actually don't know what the hell she's talking about, but whatever. Eslo, his curse from Vaati having been broken due to the Sorcerer's death, is transformed back into his original body. He explains to Zelda that this whole mess was his doing in the first place, and asks deeply for her forgiveness, before offering a potential solution for Zelda to don his magic hat and make a wish in her heart. This immediately fixes the whole castle and revives anyone who's supposed to be dead. Yep, that's it. Everything's just fixed. And then the hat falls apart right after this, tying up that little loose end of a magical MacGuffin. Everything just sort of works itself out, apparently. Eslo bids us goodbye, gives Link a green hat as a parting gift, and heads off back to the land of the Picori, never to be seen again. And that's our ending. No, I'm not kidding. The game just cuts to credits at this point. It's sort of abrupt. Alright, so before I give my final verdict, I think it would behoove us to talk about the story for just a little bit. And I do mean a little bit, because unlike with the last several games I've reviewed in this series, there isn't a whole lot to get extremely mad about here, nor to praise to hell and back. But there's still a couple interesting things to talk about with the narrative here that affect this game's overall impact, so I do want to at least briefly address them. First off, let's talk about the characters, because I think the way this game in particular handles its character writing is pretty strange. We're introduced to all sorts of names and faces right at the start. Princess Zelda, Link's childhood friend. Smith, Link's grandfather. King Daltus, father to Zelda and best friend of Smith. You get the point. A whole series of connections can be drawn between these many different characters, and yet, for some reason, they're all dropped as soon as the prologue finishes. Smith never factors into the plot again. Daltus doesn't either, outside you rescuing him at the end. Princess Zelda is dropped entirely until suddenly being propped up as a major plot device right at the very end of the game. You get the point. Despite taking the time to establish a wide cast of characters with understandable and realistic relationships with one another, the game kinda just doesn't do anything with them. The rest of the narrative is taken over entirely by Eslo, who essentially serves as Link's mouth in this game, and whatever character of the week we run into during each quest. And none of these episodic characters have arcs or interesting stories to tell of their own, so I have to ask, what's the purpose of having so many characters in your game if you're not gonna do anything with them? Let's just compare this game for a moment to one of its predecessors in this regard. And to make things fair, I'm not going to use some complex 3D mainline title with a massive budget. I'm going to compare this game game to the simplest, least resource-intensive Zelda game ever made, Link's Awakening. This is an 8-bit, black and white, simple Zelda game with an extremely straightforward narrative, and yet, the way it handles its character writing is so much more complex and interesting than anything we see in the Minish Cap. Similarly to the Minish Cap, it introduces a few key characters at the very beginning who get you going on your journey. Malon, the island girl who saves Link from certain death, Talon, her father, and a mushroom forager who constantly gets himself into trouble, and of course, all the other many residents of Koholint Village, who all have family members, interests, and personal relationships with one another. And, unlike the Minish Cap, Link's Awakening does not relegate these many characters to the sidelines. Talon appears as one of the first obstacles, blocking the way to the Tail Key, and appearing later on as a target during the trading quest line. Malon, meanwhile, acts as the entire emotional heart of that game, teaching Link the Ballad of the Windfish, sharing with him her hopes and dreams, and even growing a cute little crush on him. And all of this character development leads to a final, tremendous narrative gut punch right at the end, as the player is forced to destroy the Dream Island of Koholint in order to save both Link and the Windfish, and to return to the real world and its real people once again, effectively killing everyone on the island in the process, including the characters we've all come to love so much. So let's compare the masterclass storytelling of that tiny 8-bit Zelda game to the Minish Cap. Our female lead, Zelda, has about 10 minutes of total screen time, and expresses no personal goals, character traits, or interesting quirks outside of a mildly charming opening section. Smith, Link's grandfather, caretaker, and probably closest confidant, is completely written out of the plot post the first 15 minutes of the game. The entire royal court doesn't have a role in this story past the beginning, and none of the newly introduced characters after this point have much of anything to add substance-wise to this tale. In fact, what even is this game's narrative about? Absolutely nothing. The plot only serves to justify the events we see on screen, that's it. And I mean, look, it's not as though I don't have some respect for the idea of keeping a game's plot at a minimum for the sake of facilitating gameplay. I actually appreciate this kind of approach way more than a game like The Wind Waker, or Skyward Sword, or especially Tears of the Kingdom. I would prefer to have no story in my Zelda game over a god-awful one any day of the week. Again, Zelda 1 is an absolute favorite of mine, and it literally has no story to tell until the last 30 seconds. But that doesn't mean the Minish Cap is immune from criticism in this regard, especially since it does take the time to tell some sort of story, even for as minimal as it might be. I think the real failure in this regard, and my biggest point of contention with this game's writing, comes from our guide character, Eslo, because not only is he a glorified walking translator for our silent protagonist, a role which adds absolutely no depth to any of these quests, like the way Tattle from Majora's Mask managed to enhance the Anju and Cafe questline, but he also annoys the player with an excessive amount of unsolicited advice, solutions to puzzles, and worst of all, completely inane, asinine comments which aren't even necessary from a gameplay or story perspective. And to top all of that off, he kinda just dips out at the end, without showing any regret or remorse over the fate of his former apprentice. Seriously, Vaati was like a son to him, a young ward he took in at an early age and raised to be a great sorcerer. And we fucking kill him at the end of this game. Shouldn't that be a big deal to Eslo? Should he not comment on this massively impactful death, and on his regret that such a drastic solution was necessary to end this conflict? Does he perhaps take some responsibility for having raised the child to be this way in the first place? Honestly, if it weren't for just how god-awful the King of Red Lions was from a story perspective, then I'd easily feel confident enough to call Eslo the worst implementation of a guide character in the series up until this point. Although it should be noted, his excessive chatting and unending advice is a sign of the changing times, of the garbage, hand-holdy game design of the 2000s seeping further into the DNA of the Legend of Zelda series. Eslo is an example of how not to implement a guide character in a Zelda game. And frankly, given that he is this game's only major supporting character, I'd say that's a pretty damning condemnation of this game's writing as a whole. Lastly, I just want to put it out there that this game's plot kinda just doesn't fit with much of the pre-established Zelda lore. I'm fine with the Picori. I honestly don't find their existence to be troubling in the slightest, and they're rather inoffensive, if a bit bland, but people like the Wind Tribe don't factor into any of the previous or future games in this series, and they're wholly underdeveloped, so I kinda don't even see the point of having them in this game at all, especially since the Picori themselves were said to have come from the sky. Even if that tale isn't actually true, I feel like having Sky Picori would have been less intrusive to the series lore, and much more interesting within the world of the Minish Cap in particular, than this enigmatic, ultimately bland tribe of humans who never factor into the series ever again. Also, I'm 100% certain the Light Force is literally just the Triforce, since it has the same function and appears as a golden triangle emanating a golden power. But it has an alternative name in this game for the sake of mystery, I guess. The Zelda Wiki tries to claim it's a separate entity entirely, but come on guys, seriously? It's a golden fucking triangle with omnipotent wish-granting abilities, which is directly tied to the divine bloodline of the Hyrule royal family. What the fuck else is it if not the Triforce? This entire rebranding attempt and effort to hide the identity of this magical MacGuffin in the first place is pretty stupid. And the idea that the Picori gifted it to man is strange, given that it was created by the goddesses originally, but whatever. The point is, this game clearly doesn't fit in within any canon Zelda storyline, and that's fine. It's a side game made by Capcom. I don't expect it to be canon, no matter what the modern Zelda timeline says. Sure, later official Zelda timelines try to shove this game into the storyline by making up complete bullshit, but I'm 100% certain that Fujibayashi and the team at Flagship were not concerned with fitting this game into the storyline of the Zelda series in even the slightest. So trying to do so post-release is ultimately meaningless. Nintendo, please stop trying to make the timeline happen. It's not going to happen. In the end, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap is a game that lives and dies not based on the merit of its storytelling, character writing, or any deeper sense of narrative meaning, but rather by how well it manages to craft an original Zelda experience all of its own making. And for what it's worth, this game is a totally unique experience. This is not some sort of derivative, tick-for-tack retread of past Zelda games, but with a different coat of paint, the way the Oracle games were. Minish Cap is, for better and for worse, the full original vision of what developers at Capcom believed a Zelda game should look like. It's undeniable that, in many ways, they managed to get plenty of things wrong. The overworld, for as beautiful as it might be visually, is incredibly small and scarce in substantial optional content. The dungeons, for as thematically beautiful and mechanically interesting as they can be, are generally railroaded far too heavily, devoid of proper incremental difficulty, and don't build on their central mechanics enough to match the quality of past Zelda games' level designs. And the Kinstone system is just absolute garbage. There's no other way to put it. It feels far too video gamey and disconnected from the actual game world. It doesn't add any depth to the characters or gameplay, and ultimately kills a lot of the joy you'd otherwise find in exploring a Zelda game's overworld. Nothing is more disappointing than finding a secret cave, fighting some enemies, solving a puzzle or two, only to find another overabundant Kinstone piece waiting at the end. In many ways, the third-party nature of this product comes through in its often inconsistent game design, making the Minish Cap feel like a side project rather than a proper entry in the mainline Zelda series. However, none of those negatives take away from the few but keyly important areas where this game does get things right. Most obviously, this is by far the prettiest 2D Zelda game ever made up until this point. And maybe still, honestly, I don't know, I do love the way the Link's Awakening remake looks, but it's a toss-up for sure. And the music is also quite the banger. Mitsuhiko Takano, the game's composer, had never worked on a Zelda game before nor since, but for this singular project, he somehow managed to perfectly capture the charm of Koji Kondo's sounds. From the epic scale of Mount Crenal, to the spooky landscape of the Royal Valley, to the long frozen hallways of the Temple of Droplets, there isn't a single moment in the Minish Cap where I don't feel like I'm hearing a proper, top-tier Zelda soundtrack playing in the background. The combat is smooth, and the enemy design is mostly quite good. There are a few too many repeats here and there, particularly with the Dark Nut fight and the insects present in the Temple of Droplets, but battles like the ones against the Choo-Choo, the Gleerock, Mazal, the Big Octorok, the Georg pair, and Vaati himself go unmatched in most Zelda games. In fact, that whole list was made up entirely of this game's many dungeon bosses. Not a single one misses. I actually think that's a first for the series. Hell, even A Link to the Past, which I still consider to have the best boss fights from the series overall, also gave us the Vitreous fight, which is one of the worst boss battles from the whole series. To craft such a consistently excellent lineup of main dungeon bosses is no small feat, and absolutely deserves high praise. And even despite the few shortcomings it might have, the main gimmick of this game, the shrinking ability, is utilized quite well and manages to change the player's perspective of the world and the puzzle solving in meaningful and interesting ways. And its integration with certain dungeons missions, traversal challenges, and especially boss fights is exceptionally impressive. It may not have the immediacy of the masks from Majora, or the depth of traveling through time like in Ocarina, but it is a substantial change to the gameplay that forces the player to look upon the world and level design in a brand new light. And that's really the core of what matters with a mechanic like this. I give The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap a 6 out of 10. This game isn't bad. It really isn't. Sure, there are bad things about it. I'd hate having to pull a gacha machine in a fucking Zelda game just to get my final piece of heart, and I certainly do not care for the Kinstone system, which stretches out the already controversial trading quest lines of old into a game-spanning endeavor that gates off every meaningful piece of optional content behind it. And yeah, the story is bare bones and a little dumb at times. And sure, Eslo can be super annoying whenever he interrupts a puzzle I'm trying to solve by telling me the solution of said puzzle, but there's certainly more good than bad here. The look and feel of this game is on point. The dungeons are decently designed on average and are thematically memorable. Shrinking Link adds all sorts of interesting depth and details to the world design and puzzle solving, and the combat is pretty satisfying, with generally decent enemy variety and a well-crafted lineup of boss battles. All in all, the Minish Cap works itself out to be a middling, somewhat memorable entry in the series, but one which certainly doesn't improve or build upon the formula, mechanics, or tropes of the past games. It is the perfect 6 out of 10. An above average video game, one which can easily be recommended to any fans of the genre, but not a title that will necessarily wow your socks off. Unless you're a big pixel art enthusiast. Then you should probably force yourself to play this game regardless of your enjoyment for the Zelda series, cause holy shit is this game beautiful. So that was the Minish Cap. Thank you one and all so much for watching. We're nearing the 5-year anniversary of this channel, and I just want to say thank you all so much for getting me this far. 10,000 subscribers is a big milestone, and it's crazy to actually get recognized in random comment sections on other people's YouTube videos. You have no idea just how much joy it brings me to hear that so many people across the internet love what I do and are looking forward to my new videos. Speaking of which, if you want to be informed when the next video comes out, and that will be soon since I already have a finished script for the next project, no, it isn't Twilight Princess, but that is coming, feel free to subscribe and give the video a like if you liked it. And if you didn't, then wow, I'm surprised you made it to the end. Thanks for that. How about you comment down below telling me why I'm wrong and how this is actually the bestest game ever. I still try to engage with every comment I can, so hopefully we can hash things out with facts and logic down there. Until next time, I've been Octorok Reviews, and have yourselves a very nice day.